Close your eyes, dear listener, and let us drift back across the centuries. Imagine the mists settling softly upon green hills, the quiet rustle of forests untouched by stone cities, the waves brushing gently against Britain's ancient shores. Our story tonight is not one of sudden arrivals or violent upheaval, but of slow transformations, changes that stretched across lifetimes, like the tide that gradually shapes the shore. The story of the ancient Britons begins in the fading glow of the Bronze Age, around 800 years before the time we now call Christ's birth. This was no single dramatic moment, but a long unfolding of migrations, exchanges, and new discoveries that washed over the islands little by little. Across the narrow waters that separate Britain from continental Europe came waves of Celtic-speaking peoples, carrying with them ideas and skills that would gently, yet profoundly, reshape the culture of these lands. They carried with them the influences of what scholars call the Hallstatt culture, named for discoveries far away in Austria. This Iron Age civilization, flourishing between 800 and 450 years before Christ, was remarkable for its craft and trade. Its people shaped metals with great skill, honored their dead with elaborate burials, and carried goods along networks of exchange that stretched from the cold Baltic north to the warm Mediterranean south. When these patterns reached the shores of Britain, they did not sweep away what already existed. Instead, they mingled, blending with the traditions of Bronze Age communities who had long built their own settlements, farms, and monuments. Archaeologists see this mingling most clearly in the fragments of pottery left behind. New forms appeared: angular bowls, tall storage jars, and vessels decorated with careful incisions and patterns. At places such as All Canning's Cross in Wiltshire, these pots whisper of a change not born of conquest, but of sharing, of people learning from one another, and slowly weaving new traditions into the old. Metals, too, carried new stories. The bronzes of earlier ages, short leaf-shaped swords and simple tools, gave way to objects inspired by continental design. Socketed axes with their curious side loops, spearheads with strong midribs, and longer, sturdier swords appeared. Though bronze was still cherished, iron began to make its quiet entrance, at first only a supplement, but slowly growing in importance, shaping blades and tools that would endure for centuries. The way people honored their dead also shifted. In earlier times, cremation had been common, the ashes placed with care. Now, burials became more elaborate. Graves were filled not only with bodies, but with goods that spoke of rank and status. Warriors were laid to rest with swords of iron, shields of bronze, ornaments of beauty. Some were buried with their chariots, rituals seen also on the continent, but now brought into British soil. The Eris culture of Yorkshire shows this vividly: graves where warriors, their chariots, and their symbols of power lie still, echoing the connections across Europe. Even the land itself was being reshaped. Agriculture had begun long before, but the arrival of Celtic traditions made it more systematic, more organized. Fields spread across the countryside, divided and marked with trackways. At places such as Fongate near Peterborough, archaeologists see careful lines cut into the earth, dividing land for crops and guiding movement across the terrain. Populations grew more stable, more settled, feeding themselves with greater certainty. Rising from these landscapes were the great hill forts, those commanding strongholds that remain some of the most striking features of Iron Age Britain. Not mere refuges, they were centers of life, symbols of power, defense, and community. Some were small, perched on modest rises. Others, like Maiden Castle in Dorset, were vast, with ramparts and ditches curling across the land, enclosing over 40 acres. To build such defenses required thousands of hands, coordinated effort, and leaders with the vision to command. Within their walls lay workshops, granaries, and homes. At Danbury in Hampshire, excavations have revealed evidence of crafts, metalworking fires, pottery kilns, and spinning whorls from textile making. Storage pits held the food that sustained the settlement. And among these were artifacts of wealth, marking the households of those who held sway. Not all life unfolded behind ramparts. Many communities thrived in valleys and along coasts, where farmland was rich and rivers flowed. Here, the roundhouse became the heart of domestic life. These timber-framed homes, wide in diameter, with conical thatched roofs, sheltered families through cold winters and long days. Inside, the hearth glowed at the center, warmth and light radiating outward. Around it, spaces were set aside for cooking, for storing grain, for sleeping. The roundhouse was more than a building. It was a circle of life, echoing the shape of the sun, the wheel, the seasons. As families and tribes grew, so too did their words. The language of these newcomers, the ancestor of Celtic speech, blended with the tongues already here. From this fusion arose the family of languages we call Brittonic, spoken across the island. Names of rivers, the Thames, the Trent, preserve these ancient sounds. Place names, tribal names, words later borrowed into Latin, all are echoes of that shift. This was not a simple replacement of one speech with another, but a weaving together, where older voices left traces in the new. In time, these tongues would diverge into Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, yet in the early days, much of Britain spoke in ways still mutually understood. Religion, too, grew and shifted, rooted both in old traditions and in new beliefs. Sacred sites of stone, the great circles like Stonehenge, did not vanish, but their meanings changed, adapted to Celtic ritual. Groves of trees, springs bubbling from the earth, rivers winding through valleys, these became holy places, touched with divine presence. Offerings of swords, shields, and ornaments were laid into waters, gifts for unseen gods. The Thames itself has yielded countless treasures, finely crafted weapons and gleaming shields, deliberately cast into its depths. And then there were the Druids, who began to emerge as a learned class. Their role was not only religious, but legal and educational. They knew the laws, the histories, the rituals. Sacred groves, known as nemetons, became their sanctuaries. These woodland spaces, lying between settled lands, hosted festivals, councils, and lessons. Though the traces left behind are faint, the later words of Roman writers confirm their power and mystery. It is easy to imagine their figures beneath ancient oaks, their voices carrying through the quiet night, shaping the rhythms of Celtic life. As centuries passed, tribes formed, each with their own lands, leaders, and identities. By around 800 years before Christ, the islands were no longer merely scattered kin groups, but a mosaic of confederations, woven together by trade, war, and shared tradition. Among them rose the Brigantes, stretching across the north. Their lands spanned the Pennine uplands, the Yorkshire Dales, and beyond, some 20,000 square miles. They were a federation of subtribes, bound by allegiance yet retaining local ties. Their stronghold at Stanwick in North Yorkshire bore vast defences, enclosing hundreds of acres. Within, evidence of workshops, storage, and imported goods suggests a bustling centre, tied into networks that reached far into Europe. Further south were the Iceni, their wealth rooted in the fertile lands of Norfolk and Suffolk. Their soil was rich, their agriculture abundant, their herd strong. They struck coins of gold and silver, among the first in Britain, marked with horses, symbols of their strength in cavalry. These coins speak of metallurgical skill and wide-reaching trade, for they traveled well beyond Iceni lands. Then there were the Cativellani, seated in the southeast, near today's Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire. Their position astride rivers and trade routes gave them power and wealth. At Verulamium, their capital, stood a great oppidum, a proto-city, with planned quarters, workshops for pottery and metal, markets alive with exchange, and defenses both natural and human-made. Their leaders, adorned in imported luxuries, wine, oil, fine pottery from the Mediterranean, kept close ties with continental kin, adopting fashions and sharing alliances. To the west, in the rugged mountains of Wales, the Silures held sway. Their land was harsh but defensible. Their warriors were fierce, masters of ambush, vanishing into valleys after striking. Their metalwork reflected their environment, sturdy, specialized, designed for mountain fighting. Alongside them, the Ordovices controlled Snowdonia and its uplands, their economy tied to herding and to the rich copper mines of their region. From these mines, metals flowed outward, feeding trade far beyond their rocky home. Each tribe carried its own ways, but all shared in the wider Celtic tapestry of Britain. Together they built, traded, fought, and celebrated. Alongside them, smaller groups, the Durotriges of Dorset, the Dumnonii of Devon and Cornwall, the Corieltavi of the Midlands, wove their own patterns into the story. The growth of Oppida, those early urban centers, marked a turning point. No longer just forts, they became hubs of commerce, administration, and leadership. At Camulodunum, near modern Colchester, vast earthworks enclosed a thriving settlement. Craftsmen forged iron tools, potters shaped decorated vessels, weavers spun cloth, leatherworkers fashioned harnesses and armor. Merchants from Gaul and beyond brought wine and oil, and in return carried away British products, grain, metals, livestock. And yet, even as these settlements grew, the older hill forts did not vanish. Maiden Castle remained a testament to the power of human hands, its multiple ramparts snaking across the hills. Inside, elite houses rose above common dwellings, storage pits held grain, and workshops echoed with labor. Here, social hierarchies were plain. Nobles, their ancestry traced to founding lines, ruled by right of land, wealth, and war. Warriors, trained from youth, wielded swords not only for battle but as symbols of honor. Their shields and blades were decorated, testaments to both status and skill. And among them moved the Druids, keepers of law and lore, teachers and mediators, carrying knowledge not in books but in memory, recited across decades of learning. Their sacred groves were schools as much as sanctuaries, places where wisdom passed from one generation to the next. They served as judges in disputes, as voices of authority, and as bridges between tribes that might otherwise clash. In a world where honor and courage ruled, their wisdom held a different kind of power, one that endured even when swords grew silent. And so, by the eve of Rome's gaze turning toward Britain, the land was alive with culture, complexity, and spirit. Tribes strong in identity, settlements bustling with trade, warriors proud, druids wise, all woven together into a tapestry both ancient and ever-changing. As we pause here, dear listener, let the echoes of these Iron Age voices drift softly into the night. Imagine the fires within roundhouses glowing against the dark, warriors sharpening blades, druids whispering beneath sacred oaks. This was the Britain before Rome, a land vibrant and alive, waiting for the next tide of change to wash across its shores. And so, dear listener, when last we paused, Britain was a land of tribes, of roundhouses glowing with firelight, of druids whispering in sacred groves. It was a world woven with the rhythm of the seasons, with warriors and chieftains, with fields and hills and waters that shaped the people's lives. But beyond the narrow sea, another power was stirring, a power that would one day reach across the channel and leave its mark upon these isles, the might of Rome. The Romans had already extended their empire across Gaul, which we now call France. From there, Britain seemed but a step away, a mysterious island, spoken of in rumor, rich in metals and land, and filled with people who both traded with and resisted the outside world. Julius Caesar himself, in the 1st century before Christ, made brief forays into Britain. He did not stay, but his writings tell us of fierce tribes, of painted warriors, and of leaders both bold and cunning. It would not be until the year 43 after Christ that Rome came in force. Under Emperor Claudius, legions crossed the sea and pressed into Britain, shields gleaming, standards raised. Some tribes resisted fiercely, while others, seeking advantage, allied themselves with the newcomers. Slowly, province by province, Rome spread its grasp. The changes were immense. Where once hill forts had dominated, now Roman towns and villas rose, built in stone and tile, with straight roads binding them together. At Colchester, London, St. Albans, Bath, and beyond, cities emerged with forums, baths, and amphitheaters. Villas dotted the countryside, with mosaic floors and heated rooms, blending Roman luxury with British landscapes. The legions built fortresses, their walls strong, their order unshaken. But beneath these new forms, older traditions lingered. The Britons did not vanish. They spoke their Celtic tongues, they honored their gods, they tilled their fields as they had for generations. Rome was a layer laid upon Britain, but the deeper roots remained. There were, of course, moments of fierce defiance. None more famous than the rising of Boudica, Queen of the Iceni. Her story is told with sorrow and pride, how her people, mistreated by Roman governors, rose in rebellion. She led her warriors against Roman towns, burning and destroying, before being crushed by the disciplined legions. Though her revolt ended in defeat, her spirit became part of Britain's memory, a symbol of resistance, a reminder that the island was never wholly tamed. Over the centuries of Roman rule, from the 1st century to the early 5th, Britain was shaped in countless ways. Trade flourished, bringing glass, wine, and oil from distant lands. Christianity began to spread, quietly at first, then more openly, finding root even here at the edge of the empire. Roads stitched the island together, so well built that some remain today. And yet, for all this Roman presence, the soul of the Britons endured, murmuring beneath the weight of empire. Then, in the early 5th century, Rome's power began to crumble. Pressures on the continent pulled the legions away. By around 410, Rome had withdrawn its soldiers, leaving Britain to fend for itself. The grand towns and villas fell into silence, their stones slowly crumbling. Fields became overgrown, roads less traveled. A new age had begun. In this post-Roman world, the tribes and peoples of Britain once more defined their own destinies. But they were not alone. Across the sea came new migrations, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, settling in the eastern and southern lands. They brought their own languages, their own customs, which mingled with and often pressed against the older Brittonic ways. It was in this time that the Britons, once spread across all of the island, began to retreat westward and northward. In Wales, in Cornwall, in Cumbria, and across the sea to Brittany in France, their languages and traditions endured most strongly. The Brittonic speech that once stretched across Britain fractured into regional forms, Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, yet each kept the rhythm of the older tongue. This was also the age from which legends grew. Stories of warriors, kings, and defenders of the Britons were told and retold by firesides, carried by bards and poets. Among them rose the tales of Arthur, a leader who, in some traditions, fought against the Saxon advance. Whether he was a real figure or a tapestry of memory woven from many leaders, his name endured through centuries, a dream of unity and defiance, a reminder of a Britain that once was. In Wales, kingdoms formed, each with its own rulers and poets. The mountains and valleys shielded them, allowing Brittonic culture to hold fast. The Welsh tongue grew in strength, its poetry rich, its traditions deep. In Cornwall, too, the Brittonic spirit remained, though over time Saxon influence pressed harder. Across the Channel, in Brittany, exiled Britons carried their language and ways, founding communities that still echo that heritage today. The Druids of earlier centuries had faded, but their influence lingered in memory. Christianity spread across the Britons, blending with older traditions, giving rise to a distinct Celtic form of the faith. Monasteries were founded, where monks wrote and taught, where illuminated manuscripts carried the wisdom of both faith and history. Saints walked these lands, their names still remembered: David in Wales, Illtyd, and many others, shaping a spirituality that was deeply rooted in both land and people. The centuries rolled on, and Britain was never still. Norse raiders came, their longships slicing across the waters, striking coasts and valleys alike. The Britons resisted where they could, adapted where they must. In Wales, in Cornwall, in the scattered kingdoms, they endured, sometimes pushed to the margins, but never erased. And in time, the Norman conquest brought yet another wave of change. Castles of stone rose, lords from across the sea claimed power, and yet, again, the Brittonic voice persisted. The Welsh poets continued their songs, the Cornish their speech, the Breton their traditions across the sea. Though often overshadowed by the might of kingdoms and empires, their culture was never extinguished. Through all these centuries, the Britons carried forward not only language but memory. Their myths of gods and heroes, their reverence for nature, their poetry and song, all survived, shaping the identity of lands we still know today. Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, each bears the imprint of the ancient Britons, each a living remnant of a people whose story stretches back to the Bronze Age and beyond. So, dear listener, as we reach the end of our long journey, let us pause. Picture again the Britain of long ago, the roundhouses glowing against the dusk, the voices of druids beneath sacred oaks, the clatter of swords upon shields, the songs of poets praising chiefs and heroes. Imagine the Romans marching their roads, the Saxons settling the fields, the Welsh kings ruling from mountain halls, the saints raising their monasteries, the poets weaving their verses. It is a tapestry woven not in haste, but over centuries, threads of many colors entwined, Celtic and Roman, Saxon and Norman. Yet through it all, the voice of the Britons whispers. You can hear it in the rivers that still bear their ancient names, in the hills that shaped their lives, in the languages still spoken in corners of the land. And now, as your eyes grow heavy, let that whisper lull you further into rest. The story of the Britons is not one of sudden beginnings or sharp endings, but of endurance, of quiet transformation, of a people whose spirit survived every tide of change. Drift now with their memory, let the echoes of their songs carry you into dreams, where roundhouses still stand, fires still glow, and the voices of the Britons still murmur softly through the night. Craftsmen occupied important positions within tribal hierarchies with skilled metal. Workers, potters, and other specialists enjoying status that reflected their essential contributions to community welfare. Mastersmiths who could create superior weapons and tools gained recognition that extended beyond their immediate tribes, with some individuals attracting patronage from multiple aristocratic families. The transmission of craft knowledge occurred through apprenticeship systems that preserve technical traditions while allowing for innovation and adaptation to changing requirements. Cattle wealth formed the foundation of tribal economies, with herds serving as both practical resources and indicators of social status. Large cattle holdings provided meat, milk, hides, and other products essential for daily life, while also representing portable wealth that could be moved during conflicts or traded for other goods. Cattle raids between tribes served multiple functions, providing opportunities for young warriors to demonstrate their courage while redistributing wealth and maintaining competitive balance between groups. Prestige goods imported from continental Europe played crucial roles in maintaining social hierarchies and facilitating diplomatic relationships. Wine airy from Mediterranean regions became symbols of aristocratic status with elaborate drinking ceremonies demonstrating hosts' wealth and sophistication. Coral ornaments, amber jewelry, and fine metal work created in Gaul or other European regions served as diplomatic gifts that sealed alliances and marked important social transitions such as marriages or coming-of-age ceremonies. Trade networks connecting Britain with continental Europe expanded dramatically during this period, creating commercial relationships that influenced political developments and cultural evolution. Merchants established regular routes that carried British exports, including metals, agricultural products, hunting, dogs, and slaves to European markets while returning with luxury goods, raw materials, and manufactured items unavailable in Britain. These trading relationships created dependencies that influenced tribal policies and provided incentives for maintaining peaceful relations with continental neighbors. The Latin artistic tradition reached Britain through these commercial and cultural connections, introducing decorative styles that British craftsmen adapted to local preferences and materials. British metal workers incorporated Latin motifs into their traditional designs, creating hybrid styles that combined continental sophistication with indigenous Celtic traditions. This artistic fusion appeared in weapons, jewelry, horse equipment, and ceremonial objects that demonstrated their owners' cosmopolitan connections while maintaining distinctly British characteristics. The spiritual landscape of Celtic Britain operated through an intricate system that permeated every aspect of daily life, from the seasonal rhythms governing agricultural cycles to the complex legal proceedings that resolve tribal disputes. At the heart of this religious framework stood the Druids, a learned class whose influence extended far beyond ceremonial functions to encompass education, jurisprudence, medicine, and the preservation of cultural memory through oral tradition. The Druidical system represented one of the most sophisticated intellectual institutions in prehistoric Europe, requiring initiates to undergo training periods that could extend for 20 years or more. Aspiring Druids memorized vast collections of religious law, legal precedents, genealogies, astronomical observations, and practical knowledge, essential for tribal governance. This educational process occurred entirely through oral transmission as Druids deliberately avoided committing their sacred knowledge to writing, believing that written records diminish the power and accuracy of memorized traditions. The social position of Druids within Celtic society granted them extraordinary privileges and responsibilities that transcended normal tribal boundaries. Unlike warriors or craftsmen whose loyalties remained tied to specific tribal groups, Druids maintained networks that span the entire Celtic world, facilitating communication and diplomatic exchange between otherwise hostile tribes. The sacred groves served as neutral territories where representatives from different groups could meet safely while their reputation for wisdom and impartiality made them natural arbitrators in complex legal disputes. Juridical education centers, typically located in secluded woodland areas considered sacred to particular deities, attracted students from across Britain and Gaul. These forest mice operated according to strict hierarchies that reflected broader Celtic social structures while maintaining their own internal systems of advancement and specialization. Senior Druids served as teachers and administrators while junior members performed supporting roles that included maintaining sacred sites, preparing ritual materials, and assisting in ceremonial functions. The curriculum mastered by Druids encompassed multiple specialized areas that reflected their diverse responsibilities within tribal society. Religious knowledge included detailed understanding of Celtic mythology, seasonal festivals, proper ritual procedures, and the complex relationships between human communities and supernatural forces. Legal training involved memorizing customary laws, precedents from previous cases, and procedures for conducting trials and enforcing judgments. Medical instruction covered herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and healing rituals that combined practical treatment with spiritual intervention. Astronomical knowledge formed a crucial component of Druidical education, enabling priests to calculate festival dates, predict eclipses, and maintain chondrical systems that coordinated religious and agricultural activities. The colony calendar, though discovered in Gaul, represents the type of sophisticated timekeeping system that British Druids likely employed to organize their complex ceremonial cycles. This bronze tablet records a lunar solar calendar that reconciled lunar months with solar years through intricate mathematical calculations, demonstrating the advanced mathematical skills required of Druidical practitioners. Sacred groves known as netta in the Celtic languages functioned as the primary venues for Druidical activities and tribal religious observances. These woodland sanctuaries occupied carefully selected locations that combined practical accessibility with spiritual significance, often situated near springs, unusual rock formations, or other natural features believed to facilitate communication with supernatural forces. Archaeological investigations at sites such as Hayling Island in Hampshire have revealed evidence of timber structures within sacred enclosures, suggesting that some groves included built environments that supplemented natural settings. The management of sacred groves required specialized knowledge of forestry practices that maintained appropriate conditions for religious activities while preserving the natural character essential to their spiritual function. Druids selectively cleared undergrowth to create ceremonial spaces while protecting ancient trees that served as focal points for particular rituals. Oak trees held special significance in Druidical practice with their longevity and impressive size, making them suitable symbols of divine power and temporal continuity. Ritual deposits discovered throughout Britain provide compelling archaeological evidence for the religious practices that characterize Celtic spirituality. The site of Lyn Carrickback on Angles has yielded one of the most spectacular assemblages of votive offerings from Iron Age Britain, including weapons, tools, slave chains, and vehicle fittings that were deliberately deposited in the lake over several centuries. The quality and variety of these objects indicate that the site attracted offerings from across Wales and beyond, suggesting its importance as a regional religious center. The Thames ritual landscape represents another crucial source of evidence for Celtic religious practices, with hundreds of high-quality metalwork pieces recovered from the river between London and its source in Worcestershire. These deposits include elaborately decorated shields, swords, with precious metal inlays, and personal ornaments that represent some of the finest craftsmanship of their respective periods. The Battersea shield discovered near Battersea Bridge in London exemplifies the sophisticated artistic traditions associated with ritual deposits, featuring intricate Latin designs executed in bronze with coral and glass inlays. The deliberate nature of these river deposits becomes clear through analysis of their locations and contexts. Objects were typically placed in specific areas where rivers change direction, flowed around islands, or past significant landmarks, suggesting that these locations held particular spiritual significance. The condition of deposited items indicates they were often new or recently repaired when offered, demonstrating that communities sacrificed valuable resources rather than disposing of worn-out equipment. Celtic cosmology envisioned a universe structured around multiple interconnected realms that influenced human affairs through complex patterns of interaction and exchange. The other world, known by various names in different Celtic languages, existed parallel to the human world but remained accessible through specific locations, times, and ritual procedures. This supernatural realm served as the dwelling place of gods, spirits, and the honored dead, while also functioning as the source of wisdom, inspiration, and magical power that could benefit human communities. The boundaries between the human world and otherworld became permeable during certain seasons and at particular locations, creating opportunities for communication and exchange between mortal and supernatural beings. Samhain, celebrated at the beginning of November, marked the most significant of these liminal periods when the barriers between worlds weakened sufficiently to allow extensive supernatural activity. During this festival, communities honored their ancestors while taking precautions against malevolent spirits that might exploit the increased permeability between realms. Beltane, observed at the beginning of May, celebrated fertility and renewal through rituals that ensured successful crops and healthy livestock. Communities drove cattle between specially prepared bonfires that purified the animals and protected them from disease, while people leaped over smaller fires to gain similar benefits. The festival marked the beginning of the summer grazing season, when cattle moved to upland pastures, making the protective rituals essential for pastoral communities dependent on their herd's welfare. Lugnasad, held in early August, commemorated the harvest season and honored Luke, a deity associated with skill, craftsmanship, and sovereignty. The festival featured competitive games, craft displays, and trading activities that brought together communities from extensive areas. Archaeological evidence suggests that some hill forts and oppida hosted large gatherings during this period, with temporary structures erected to accommodate visitors and extensive areas cleared for athletic competitions and market activities. The winter solstice festival, later known as Alban Arthan in Welsh traditions, celebrated the return of increasing daylight and the promise of spring's eventual arrival. Communities maintained sacred fires throughout the longest night, symbolically ensuring the sun's continued journey and the renewal of natural cycles. The festival included divination practices that attempted to predict the coming year's prospects, while elaborate feasting demonstrated community solidarity during the challenging winter months. Natural features throughout the British landscape acquired sacred significance within Celtic religious systems, creating a complex geography of holy sites that reflected both local traditions and broader mythological patterns. Springs and wells served as points of contact with underground deities and provided venues for healing rituals that combined practical bathing with spiritual purification. The thermal springs at Bath attracted visitors from across Britain, with archaeological evidence indicating continuous religious activity from the Iron Age through the Roman period and beyond. Mountain peaks and prominent hills functioned as dwelling places for sky gods and observation points for astronomical phenomena essential to religious calculations. The Wrekin in Shropshire, Penifin in Wales, and numerous other elevated locations show evidence of ritual activity, including votive deposits, temporary structures, and carved symbols that marked their sacred status. These high places served as venues for seasonal festivals that required extensive visibility, while their prominence in the landscape made them natural symbols of divine authority and cosmic order. Rivers held particular Importance in Celtic religious thought as boundaries between different realms and as conduits for spiritual power. The personification of major rivers as goddesses appears throughout Celtic mythology. The Thames 7 and other significant waterways receiving regular offerings and serving as focal points for tribal religious activities. The practice of depositing valuable objects in rivers continued throughout the Iron Age, creating archaeological assemblages that demonstrate the sustained importance of aquatic ritual sites. Forests and woodland areas provided venues for the most secretive and powerful druidical rituals, particularly those involving human sacrifice and the most sacred mysteries of Celtic religion. Classical authors such as Tacitus and Pliny described druidical ceremonies conducted in remote groves where ancient trees served as natural temples and the forest canopy created appropriate atmospheres for supernatural encounters. Archaeological evidence for these woodland sanctuaries remains limited due to the perishable nature of organic materials and the deliberate secrecy surrounding druidical practices. Human sacrifice represented one of the most controversial aspects of Celtic religious practice, documented through both archaeological evidence and classical literary sources. Bodies discovered throughout northwestern Europe, including several examples from Britain, provide physical evidence for ritual killings that involved elaborate procedures designed to ensure the victim's transition to the other world. Lindo Man discovered in a Cheshire peat bog shows evidence of multiple forms of ritual death, including strangulation, throat cutting, and blunt force trauma, suggesting that his sacrifice followed complex ceremonial requirements. The practice of human sacrifice served multiple functions within Celtic society, including communication with supernatural forces, resolution of cosmic imbalances, and demonstration of community commitment to divine powers. Victims were often selected from specific social categories, including criminals, prisoners of war, and volunteers who sought honor through sacrificial death. The elaborate nature of sacrificial procedures indicates that these rituals required extensive preparation and the participation of trained specialists who understood the complex requirements for successful completion. Archaeological evidence from sites such as South Cadbury Hillford suggests that human sacrifice sometimes accompanied major construction projects or responses to community crisis. Infant burials discovered within rampart foundations may represent foundation sacrifices intended to ensure structural stability and divine protection for the fortified settlement. Similar deposits at other sites indicate that sacrificial practices extended beyond formal of religious ceremonies to encompass practical applications in construction, agriculture, and warfare. Ritual warfare represented another distinctive aspect of Celtic religious practice, combining military objectives with ceremonial requirements that honored martial deities and demonstrated tribal courage. Warriors underwent purification rituals before battle, including bathing in sacred springs and receiving blessings from druids who invoke divine protection and guidance. Battle standards incorporated religious symbols and sacred materials that connected human conflicts with cosmic struggles between order and chaos. The taking of heads from defeated enemies served both practical and spiritual purposes within Celtic warrior culture. Heads were believed to contain the essence of their owner's courage and wisdom, making them valuable trophies that could transfer these qualities to their captors. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Britons Hill in Warwickshire shows human skulls displayed at settlement entrances, while classical sources describe Celtic warriors decorating their homes and temples with the heads of notable enemies. Votive offerings encompassed a vast range of objects and materials that communities dedicated to supernatural forces in exchange for divine favor or assistance. Weapons represented the most common category of martial offerings, with swords, spears, shields, and helmets, deposited in rivers, lakes, and sacred groves throughout Britain. The quality of these offerings indicates that communities sacrificed valuable military equipment rather than obsolete or damaged items, demonstrating genuine commitment to their religious obligations. Personal ornaments including totoks, bracelets, brooches, and other jewelry formed another significant category of votive deposits. These items often showed evidence of deliberate damage or modification before deposition, suggesting that their transformation from functional objects to sacred offerings required specific ritual procedures. The famous Snedisham treasure from Norfolk includes numerous gold and silvers that may represent accumulated votive offerings from a major religious site. Agricultural tools and domestic implements appear less frequently in votive deposits but provide evidence for the religious dimensions of everyday activities. Plowshares, sickles, cauldrons, and other utilitarian objects were occasionally dedicated to deities associated with fertility, craftsmanship, or domestic prosperity. The relative rarity of such offerings may reflect their essential nature for survival, making their sacrifice particularly meaningful demonstrations of religious devotion. The organization of religious festivals and ceremonies required extensive community cooperation that reinforced social bonds while fulfilling spiritual obligations. Seasonal celebrations brought together extended kinship groups and neighboring communities for shared rituals that included feasting, competitive games, trading activities, and religious observances. These gatherings served multiple functions beyond their primary spiritual purposes, facilitating marriages, political negotiations, legal proceedings, and cultural exchange that maintained broader Celtic civilization. The archaeological record preserves evidence of these large-scale religious gatherings through the remains of temporary structures, extensive cooking facilities, and artifact assemblages that indicate the presence of visitors from distant regions. Sites such as Tara in Ireland and Eenmaka in Ulster show evidence of periodic large assemblies that attracted participants from across extensive territories. While similar patterns likely existed at major British religious centres, the religious framework that governed Celtic Britain found its most tangible expression through the sophisticated artistic traditions that emerged during the Latina period, transforming everyday objects into vehicles for spiritual and social communication. British craftsmen adapted continental European artistic styles to create distinctly insular variations that reflected local preferences while maintaining connections to broader Celtic cultural networks. These artistic developments coincided with fundamental changes in settlement patterns, economic organization, and social customs that collectively defined the character of Iron Age British civilization. The latent artistic tradition reached Britain through multiple channels of cultural transmission, including trade relationships, diplomatic exchanges, and the movement of skilled craftsmen between tribal territories. British metal workers encountered continental European decorative styles through imported objects that served as models for local production. Also, artisans may have traveled to Gaul or other regions to learn advanced techniques directly from foreign masters. The resulting British latent style combined imported motifs with indigenous artistic traditions, creating hybrid forms that demonstrated both cosmopolitan awareness and local identity. The battery shield represents the pinnacle of British latent metal working, combining technical virtuosity with artistic sophistication that rivals the finest continental European productions. Discovered in the Thames near Battersea Bridge, this bronze shield dates to approximately 350 BC and measures 77.7 centimeters in length, featuring 3 circular bosses connected by flowing curvilinear designs that demonstrate complete mastery of Latena decorative principles. The shield's construction involved multiple bronze sheets joined through complex riveting techniques, while the decorative elements incorporated coral inlays and glass studs that created brilliant color contrasts against the polished bronze surface. The artistic program of the Battersea shield reveals sophisticated understanding of symmetry, proportion, and visual rhythm that characterizes mature latent design. Each of the 3 bosses features concentric circles of decoration that draw the viewer's eye inward towards central focal points, while the connecting elements create dynamic visual movement across the shield surface. The flowing curves and spirals that dominate the composition derive from stylized plant forms, but their abstract treatment creates patterns that suggest movement and transformation rather than literal botanical representation. Technical analysis of the battery shield demonstrates the advanced metallurgical skills required for its production. The bronze alloy contains carefully controlled proportions of copper and tin that provided optimal working properties for the complex forming operations required to create the 3-dimensional decorative elements. The coral inlays were precisely fitted into prepared recesses, requiring accurate measurement and cutting techniques that indicate specialized knowledge of both materials and tools. The overall construction suggests collaboration between multiple craftsmen with complementary skills, reflecting the organized workshop systems that supported high-quality metal work production. The Desborough mirror exemplifies another distinctive British development within latent artistic traditions, demonstrating how continental decorative styles were adapted to uniquely British object types. This bronze hand mirror, discovered in Northamptonshire and dating to approximately 5010 BC, features elaborate engraved decoration on its reverse side that combines traditional latent motifs with innovative compositional arrangements. The mirror's decorative scheme centers on a complex pattern of interlocking spirals and curves that create optical illusions of depth and movement, while hatched background areas provide textural contrast that enhances the primary design elements. The production of decorated mirrors represents a distinctly British tradition within Celtic metalworking with no comparable objects known from continental European contexts. British craftsmen developed specialized techniques for creating these mirrors, including methods for achieving highly reflective surfaces through careful polishing and alloy composition. The decorative programs applied to mirrorbacks demonstrate sophisticated understanding of how engraved designs would appear when viewed from different angles and under varying lighting conditions. British sword production during the latent period combined functional requirements with decorative elements that reflected their owner's status and cultural affiliations. The anthropomorphic hilted daggers found at sites such as Minster Ditch in Oxfordshire feature human-faced pommel designs that may represent protective deities or ancestral spirits. These weapons demonstrate advanced forging techniques that produce strong, flexible blades capable of withstanding combat stress while maintaining sharp cutting edges. The decorative elements incorporated into sword hilts and scabbards required additional specialized skills in casting, engraving, and inlay work that elevated weapons beyond mere functional tools. Scabbard decoration reached extraordinary levels of sophistication in British latent metal working with examples such as the Stand Lake scabbard demonstrating complete integration of artistic and functional requirements. The bronze scabbard plates feature flowing curve linear designs that complement the weapon's form while providing protective covering for the iron blade. The decorative program includes stylized animal forms integrated into abstract patterns that create visual narratives relating to warfare, protection, or supernatural power. Talks represented the most prestigious category of Celtic personal ornaments, serving as indicators of high social status while demonstrating the technical capabilities of skilled metal workers. The Great Torque from Sneedisham, weighing over 1 kilogram and crafted from gold and silver alloy, exemplifies the finest British torque. Production. The massive neck ring features twisted rope construction, created through complex forming techniques that require precise control of metal flow and temperature. The terminals display elaborate sculptural decoration incorporating human and animal motifs that demonstrate sophisticated three-dimensional modeling skills. The production techniques employed in British torque manufacture evolved considerably during the Latin period, with early examples featuring relatively simple twisted wire construction, while later pieces incorporated complex multi-strand designs and elaborate terminal decorations. The IPS switch to talks discovered in Suffolk represent an intermediate stage in this development, featuring hollow construction that reduced weight while maintaining visual impact. The technical knowledge required for hollow forming indicates that British metal workers had mastered advanced techniques that were also employed in continental European workshops. Horse equipment provided another venue for displaying Latin artistic traditions, reflecting the importance of cavalry forces in Celtic warfare and the prestige associated with superior horsemanship. Bronze bridle bits from sites such as Pen Hill in Somerset feature elaborate decorative elements that transformed functional equipment into status symbols. The curved linear designs applied to horse gear often incorporated protective symbols or divine imagery intended to ensure the safety and performance of both horse and rider during combat or ceremonial occasions. The Pen Hill hoard includes not only horse equipment but also chariot fittings that demonstrate the continuing importance of wheeled vehicles in British Celtic society. The bronze turret rings and other chariot components feature sophisticated casting techniques and surface decoration that rival the finest contemporary metal work. The hoard's composition suggests it may have been buried during a period of conflict, preserving a complete assemblage of high-status military equipment that would otherwise have been recycled or lost. Settlement patterns across Iron Age Britain reflected both practical considerations related to defense, agriculture, and trade, as well as cultural preferences that emphasize community organization and social hierarchy. The roundhouse emerged as the standard domestic architecture throughout most of Britain, representing an architectural form that efficiently addressed climatic conditions while accommodating Celtic social customs and household organization. These circular structures typically measured between 8 and 15 m in diameter, with substantial timber framework supporting conical thatched roofs that shed rain effectively while providing excellent insulation. The construction of roundhouses required sophisticated understanding of structural engineering principles that distributed roof loads through carefully designed post and beam systems. The primary structural elements consisted of a ring of vertical posts that supported a ring beam from which rafters extended to a central ridge or apex. This construction method created strong, stable structures capable of withstanding severe weather conditions, while providing maximum interior space with minimal material requirements. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Pimp and Down in Dorset have revealed evidence of the complex carpentry techniques employed in roundhouse construction, including mortise and tenon joints and other advanced woodworking methods. The interior organization of round houses reflected Celtic social customs and household activities through carefully planned spatial arrangements. Central hearths provided focal points for domestic life while serving practical functions for cooking, heating, and light. The areas immediately surrounding hearths typically showed evidence of intensive use for food preparation and consumption, while peripheral zones accommodated sleeping areas, storage facilities, and craft activities. The positioning of doorways, usually facing southeast to maximize natural light and minimize exposure to prevailing winds, created standard orientations that may have held symbolic as well as practical significance. Regional variations in roundhouse construction techniques and decorative elements demonstrate local adaptations to environmental conditions and cultural preferences. In Wales and southwestern Britain, stone foundations became common where suitable building stone was readily available, while timber remained the primary construction material in forested regions. The use of cob, a mixture of clay, straw, and other organic materials for wall construction, appears to have been widespread, though the perishable nature of these materials limits archaeological preservation. The development of hill forts represented one of the most significant architectural achievements of Iron Age Britain, combining defensive capabilities with urban planning principles that accommodated substantial populations within fortified perimeters. The construction techniques employed in hill fort defenses evolved considerably during the Iron Age, beginning with simple earthwork ramparts and developing into sophisticated defensive systems that incorporated multiple lines of obstacles, complex entrance arrangements, and specialized architectural features designed to maximize defensive effectiveness. Maiden Castle's defensive system exemplifies the most advanced hill fort architecture, featuring multiple concentric ramparts with carefully engineered profiles that maximize the difficulty of assault while providing optimal fighting positions for defenders. The rampart's construction involved massive earth-moving operations that created steep-sided barriers up to 20 m in height, while the intervening ditches provided additional obstacles and sources of material for rampart construction. The entrance arrangements at Maiden Castle demonstrate sophisticated understanding of defensive architecture, with complex passages that forced attackers to navigate multiple turns while exposing them to concentrated defensive fire. The internal organization of hill forts reveals urban planning concepts that allocated specific areas for different activities while maintaining overall defensive coherence. Excavations at Danbury Hill Fort in Hampshire have identified distinct quarters for craft production, storage, residential occupation, and religious activities. The metal working areas clustered near defensive walls where forges could be easily supplied with fuel and raw materials while remaining protected from external attack. Storage facilities concentrated in central areas where grain pits and other food reserves could be defended most effectively during siege conditions. Craft specialization within hill for supported populations that extended far beyond simple agricultural communities, creating economic systems that resembled proto-urban settlements. The archaeological evidence from Danbury indicates the presence of specialized metal workers, potters, textile producers, and other craftsmen who served both local populations and external markets. The organization of these craft activities suggests centralized control that may have involved elite patronage or administrative oversight of production and distribution. The pottery traditions of Iron Age Britain demonstrate both continuity with earlier prehistoric styles and innovation in response to changing social requirements and technological capabilities. The development of wheel-thrown pottery during the later Iron Age represents a significant technological advancement that enabled mass production of standardized vessel forms while maintaining opportunities for decorative elaboration. The introduction of potter's wheels, probably derived from continental European models, required specialized training and workshop facilities that supported full-time craft specialists. Regional pottery styles reflect local preferences and cultural identities while participating in broader technological and stylistic developments. The Elford Swalling pottery tradition of southeastern Britain demonstrates clear continental influences, including vessel forms and decorative techniques that parallel contemporary gouache productions. These high-quality wheel-thrown vessels often featured burnished surfaces and geometric decoration that created visually striking effects through contrast between polished and unpolished areas. The Glastonbury-style pottery of southwestern Britain represents a distinctly regional tradition that combined indigenous decorative motifs with technical innovations derived from continental sources. These vessels typically featured curvilinear designs, executed through various techniques including incision stamping and applied decoration. The artistic sophistication of Glastonbury-style pottery indicates the presence of skilled craftsmen who adapted latent decorative principles to ceramic media while maintaining local cultural preferences. Textile production represented one of the most important economic activities in Iron Age Britain, supporting both local consumption and external trade through the creation of wool and cloth that gained international recognition for its quality. Archaeological evidence for textile production includes spindle WHS, loom weights, and other equipment that indicates household-level production, supplemented by more specialized workshop activities. The quality of British wool and textiles attracted attention from continental European markets with classical sources, mentioning British cloth as a significant export commodity. The organization of textile production involved complex processes that began with sheep breeding and management and extended through wool processing, spinning, weaving, and finishing operations. Different households and communities specialized in various aspects of this production chain, creating networks of interdependence that facilitated both local self-sufficiency and commercial production. The discovery of large quantities of loom weights at sites such as Glastonbury Lake Village suggests that some communities specialized in textile production for external markets. Dyeing techniques employed in Iron Age British textile production created colorful fabrics that served both practical and decorative functions. The use of local plant materials including madder weld and W provided a range of colors that could be combined through various techniques to create complex patterns and designs. The preservation of textile fragments in waterlogged conditions at sites such as Lindo Moss demonstrates the sophisticated dyeing and patterning techniques employed by Iron Age craftsmen. The economic foundation of Iron Age British society rested on mixed agricultural systems that combined crop cultivation with animal husbandry in proportions that varied according to local environmental conditions and cultural preferences. Cereal production focused primarily on wheat and barley varieties that were well adapted to British climatic conditions. While oats and rye played supplementary roles in some regions, the development of improved plow technology during the Iron Age enabled cultivation of heavier soils that had previously been unsuitable for agriculture, expanding the total area available for crop production. Field systems from the Iron Age demonstrate sophisticated understanding of land management principles that maximized agricultural productivity while maintaining soil fertility through crop rotation and other techniques. The Celtic fields, preserved in areas such as the Berkshire Downs, show evidence of systematic land division and cultivation that supported intensive agricultural production. These field systems typically featured small, roughly square plots separated by low earthwork boundaries that facilitated drainage and prevented soil erosion. Animal husbandry practices emphasize cattle, sheep, and pigs in proportions that reflected both practical considerations and cultural preferences. Cattle provided multiple products, including meat, milk, hides, and traction power for agricultural operations, while also serving as indicators of wealth and status within Celtic society. The management of cattle herds required extensive pasture lands and sophisticated knowledge of animal breeding, feeding, and health care that represented accumulated generations of practical experience. The sophisticated agricultural and craft systems that had developed across Iron Age Britain by the 2nd century BC created the economic foundation for unprecedented political transformations that would fundamentally alter the relationship between British tribes and the expanding Roman world. These changes began not through military conquest, but through gradual commercial and diplomatic connections that drew British tribal leaders into the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized late Republican politics. Across northwestern Europe, the emergence of Belgic influence in southeastern Britain represented the most significant political development of this period, fundamentally reshaping the balance of power among British tribes while creating new connections to continental European affairs. The Belg, a confederation of tribes occupying territories between the Rhine and Seine rivers, had established themselves as dominant forces in northeastern Gaul through military prowess and sophisticated political organization that combined traditional Celtic social structures with innovations derived from contact with Germanic peoples and Mediterranean civilizations. Belgic migration into Britain occurred through multiple waves of settlement that began around 150 BC and continued intermittently for over a century. These migrations differed fundamentally from earlier Celtic movements as they involved organized groups led by established aristocratic families who brought with them advanced military techniques, urban planning concepts, and diplomatic connections that immediately elevated their status within British political hierarchies. Archaeological evidence suggests that Belgic settlers concentrated initially in Kent and Essex, where they established fortified settlements that served as bases for further expansion and political consolidation. The political impact of Belgic settlement extended far beyond the territories they directly controlled, as their superior military organization and continental connections enabled them to influence neighboring British tribes through both alliance and intimidation. Belgic warriors employed advanced weapons technology, including long iron swords, reinforced shields, and sophisticated siege equipment that gave them decisive advantages in conflicts with traditional British forces. Cavalry units, trained according to continental European standards and equipped with superior horse gear, could dominate battlefields where British tribes relied primarily on infantry formations and chariot warfare. Emerged as the most significant Belgic leader to establish authority in Britain, creating a political network that spanned both sides of the English Channel and demonstrated the new forms of international diplomacy that characterized this period. Originally a king of the Atrebates in Gaul, Camus had established close relationships with Roman authorities during the early phases of Caesar's GIC campaigns, serving as a diplomatic intermediary and military ally who facilitated Roman operations against other GIC tribes. His decision to extend his authority into Britain reflected both personal ambition and strategic calculations about the changing political landscape of northwestern Europe. The establishment of Commius's British kingdom centered on the territory that would later become Hampshire and West Sussex, where he created a political structure that combined traditional Celtic kingship with innovations derived from his continental experience. His capital at Cal-Eva Atrebatum, later known as Silchester, represented one of Britain's first true urban centers, featuring planned street layouts, specialized craft quarters, and offensive works that incorporated both British and continental European architectural traditions. The settlement's organization demonstrated sophisticated understanding of urban planning principles that created an efficient system for administration, commerce, and defense. Commes's political success depended heavily on his ability to maintain relationships with both Roman authorities and British tribal leaders, requiring diplomatic skills that balance competing interests while advancing his own territorial ambitions. His position as a Roman client king provided access to military support and commercial opportunities that enhanced his power within Britain, while his British territories offered resources and strategic advantages that increased his value to Roman commanders. This complex web of relationships exemplified the new forms of international politics that emerged as Roman influence expanded into northwestern Europe. The development of proturban centers under Belgic influence represented a fundamental transformation in British settlement patterns that introduced continental European concepts of urban organization and administration. These oppida combined defensive capabilities with commercial and administrative functions that supported populations significantly larger and more specialized than traditional British hill forts. The planning and construction of these urban centers required organizational capabilities that demonstrated the sophisticated political structures emerging under Belgic leadership. Camella-Dunham, established by Cunobelinus around 10 AD, exemplified the most advanced form of British proto-urban development, incorporating features that would influence urban planning throughout the Roman period. The settlement occupied a naturally defensible position between the rivers Cologne and Schiepen, with artificial defenses supplementing natural barriers to create an impregnable stronghold. The internal organization allocated specific areas for royal residences, craft production, commercial activities, and religious observances, creating a planned urban environment that supported diverse populations and complex economic activities. The archaeological evidence from Camella-Dunham reveals extensive craft specialization that supported both local consumption and long-distance trade networks. Metalwork quarters produced high-quality weapons, tools, and decorative objects using techniques that combined traditional British methods with continental innovations. Pottery workshops created both utilitarian vessels and elaborate, decorated pieces that demonstrated technical skills comparable to contemporary Gaulish productions. The presence of imported goods, including wine and foray, fine pottery, and luxury metal work, indicates extensive commercial connections that linked Camella-Dunham to markets throughout the Roman world. The administrative systems developed within these proturban centers required new forms of record-keeping and bureaucratic organization that represented significant departures from traditional Celtic governance methods. While Druids continued to maintain oral traditions and legal precedents, the complex commercial and diplomatic activities of Belgic kingdoms necessitated written records that could document transactions, treaties, and administrative decisions. The adoption of writing systems, probably derived from Latin models, marked a crucial transition in British political culture that facilitated more sophisticated forms of governance and international relations. Diplomatic relationships between British tribes and Rome developed gradually through commercial connections, political alliances, and personal relationships that created networks of mutual interest and obligation. Roman merchants had established trading connections with British tribes as early as the 2nd century BC, exchanging Mediterranean luxury goods for British metals, agricultural products, and other commodities that commanded high prices in continental markets. These commercial relationships created dependencies that influenced political decisions and provided Roman authorities with detailed knowledge of British resources and political structures. The flow of Roman goods into Britain accelerated dramatically during the 1st century BC, creating archaeological assemblages that demonstrate the extent and sophistication of cross-channel trade networks. Wine and for Italy and southern Gaul appear in increasing quantities at high-status British sites, indicating the adoption of Mediterranean drinking customs among tribal elites who sought to demonstrate their cosmopolitan connections through conspicuous consumption of exotic luxury goods. The distribution patterns of these imports reveal the political hierarchies that controlled access to foreign trade with the greatest concentrations appearing at royal centers and other sites associated with tribal leadership. Fine pottery, imported from Gaul in the Mediterranean region, supplemented local British productions while introducing new vessel forms and decorative techniques that influence indigenous craft traditions. Terra sigillata and other high-quality ceramic types provided models for British potters who adapted continental techniques to local preferences and materials. The technical knowledge required for producing wheel-thrown pottery spread throughout southeastern Britain during this period, transforming ceramic production from household craft activities into specialized workshop industries that supported commercial distribution networks. Metalwork imports included both finished objects and raw materials that enhanced British craft production while demonstrating Roman technical capabilities. Bronze vessels, decorative fittings, and personal ornaments manufactured in Gaul and Italy provided British craftsmen with examples of advanced techniques and artistic styles that they incorporated into their own productions. The importation of high-quality iron and bronze ingots enabled British smiths to produce superior weapons and tools while experimenting with alloy compositions and manufacturing techniques derived from continental sources. The political implications of these commercial relationships extended far beyond simple economic exchange as trade connections created diplomatic channels that facilitated communication between British and Roman authorities. British tribal leaders who controlled access to valuable resources could negotiate favorable terms with Roman merchants while using their commercial relationships to enhance their status within British political hierarchies. Roman authorities in turn gained detailed intelligence about British political structures, military capabilities, and economic resources that would prove invaluable during subsequent military campaigns. Caesar's GIC wars profoundly impacted British tribes through refugee movements, changing alliance patterns, and increased Roman awareness of British affairs that transformed the political landscape of northwestern Europe. The systematic Roman conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BC displaced numerous tribal groups who sought refuge in Britain, bringing with them detailed knowledge of Roman military capabilities and political intentions. These refugees included not only common warriors and civilians, but also aristocratic families who maintained claims to continental territories and sought British support for eventual restoration attempts. The arrival of GIC refugees created complex political situations within British tribes as established leaders needed to balance humanitarian obligations with strategic considerations about Roman intentions and capabilities. Some British tribes welcomed refugees as potential allies who could provide military expertise and continental connections, while others viewed them as dangerous complications that might provoke Roman intervention. The integration of refugee populations required careful management of resources and political relationships that tested the diplomatic skills of British tribal leaders. Comus's transformation from Roman ally to British exile exemplified the complex political dynamics that emerged during this period. His initial cooperation with Roman authorities during the early phases of the GIC Wars had provided him with significant advantages in establishing his British kingdom, but his eventual opposition to Roman expansion forced him to abandon his continental territories and concentrate his efforts on consolidating British power. His experience as both Roman client and enemy provided him with unique insights into Roman capabilities and intentions that influenced British strategic planning. The military techniques and equipment introduced by GIC refugees significantly enhanced British defensive capabilities, while providing detailed intelligence about Roman tactical methods and siege warfare. Refugee warriors brought knowledge of Roman military organization, including information about legion structure, camp construction, and battlefield tactics that enabled British commanders to develop more effective countermeasures. The construction of more sophisticated defensive works at British op-ed during this period reflects the application of military engineering principles derived from continental experience. British involvement in GIC affairs extended beyond providing refuge for displaced populations to include active military support for tribes resisting Roman expansion. Archaeological evidence suggests that British warriors participated in major GIC campaigns, including the Siege of Alissa, where Vercinge made his final stand against Caesar's forces. The presence of British manufactured weapons and equipment at continental battlefields indicates organized military expeditions that represented significant commitments of resources and personnel. The political implications of British military intervention in Gaul created diplomatic complications that influenced Roman attitudes toward Britain, while demonstrating the interconnected nature of Celtic politics across northwestern Europe. British support for anti-Roman coalitions provided Caesar and other Roman commanders with justifications for eventual British campaigns, while revealing the extent of cross-channel political networks that threatened Roman security interests. The intelligence gathered during these conflicts provided Roman authorities with detailed knowledge of British military capabilities, political structures, and geographic conditions that would prove crucial during subsequent invasion planning. Channel relationships during this period involved complex networks of kinship, alliance, and economic interdependence that created political obligations extending far beyond immediate tribal boundaries. Marriage alliances between British and GIC aristocratic families created kinship networks that influenced political decisions and military commitments on both sides of the English Channel. These relationships obligated British tribes to provide military assistance to continental relatives while creating expectations of reciprocal support that could draw British leaders into conflicts far from their home territories. The economic dimensions of cross-channel relationships included not only commercial trade, but also tribute payments, diplomatic gifts, and military subsidies that created financial obligations and dependencies. British tribes that controlled valuable resources could extract tribute from continental allies while providing financial support for military campaigns that advanced their political interests. The circulation of high value objects, including gold talks, decorated weapons, and luxury goods, served diplomatic functions that reinforced alliance relationships while demonstrating the wealth and power of participating tribal leaders. Religious connections between British continental Celtic communities created additional channels for political communication and cultural exchange that supplemented secular diplomatic relationships. Druidical networks that spanned tribal boundaries facilitated information transfer and diplomatic mediation while maintaining cultural traditions that transcended political divisions. The reputation of British Druids for superior learning attracted continental students who created personal relationships that could influence political decisions and military planning. The transformation of southeastern British political structures during this period created new forms of kingship that combined traditional Celtic authority with innovations derived from continental experience and Roman influence. The emergence of coined money represented one of the most significant innovations, enabling more sophisticated economic transactions while providing rulers with means of displaying their authority through controlled monetary systems. British coins from this period often featured imagery derived from continental European models while incorporating local symbols and artistic traditions that asserted indigenous cultural identity. The development of written administrative systems supplemented traditional oral governance methods while creating new possibilities for diplomatic communication and record-keeping. The adoption of Latin alphabetic writing enabled British rulers to communicate directly with Roman authorities while maintaining records of commercial transactions, legal decisions, and diplomatic agreements that required permanent documentation. This transition represented a fundamental change in Celtic political culture that facilitated more complex forms of governance and international relations. The diplomatic networks and commercial relationships that had developed between Britain and Rome during the preceding decades provided Caesar with both justification and intelligence for his unprecedented decision to launch military expeditions across the treacherous waters of the English Channel. By 55 BC, systematic conquest of Gaul had eliminated the buffer zones that had previously separated British tribes from direct Roman military pressure, while the continuing flow of British warriors and resources to support GIC resistance movements created strategic imperatives that demanded decisive action. Caesar's first expedition in 55 BC represented more than a simple reconnaissance mission, though its limited scope and brief duration reflected the enormous logistical challenges of mounting amphibious operations against an unknown enemy. Across dangerous waters, the expedition force consisted of 2 legions, the 7th and 10th, totaling approximately 10,000 infantry supported by auxiliary cavalry units and specialized siege equipment, adapted for rapid deployment. The selection of these particular legions reflected Caesar's confidence in their combat effectiveness and their previous experience in the challenging terrain and weather conditions of northern Gaul. The crossing itself presented unprecedented challenges that tested Roman naval capabilities and engineering expertise. Caesar's engineers constructed a fleet of transport vessels specifically designed for the shallow draft requirements of beach landings, combining traditional Mediterranean galley designs with innovations derived from GIC and Germanic boat-building techniques. The vessels featured reinforced hulls capable of withstanding impact with rocky shores, while their shallow drafts enabled approach to beaches that would be inaccessible to standard Roman warships. British tribal responses to intelligence about Caesar's preparations revealed sophisticated communication networks that rapidly transmitted information across the island's political landscape. Coastal tribes mobilized defensive forces while sending urgent messages to inland allies, requesting military assistance and strategic coordination. The speed and effectiveness of these Communications demonstrated the maturity of British political systems that could coordinate responses across tribal boundaries despite traditional rivalries and territorial disputes. The landing at Deal Beach on the Kentish coast exposed both the strengths and limitations of Roman amphibious warfare. When confronted with determined opposition fighting on familiar terrain, British defenders had positioned themselves advantageously on the beach and adjacent cliffs, using their superior knowledge of local conditions to maximize the effectiveness of their resistance. Their forces included both infantry, armed with long spears and shields, and cavalry units that could exploit the mobility advantages provided by their familiarity with the coastal landscape. The British tactical approach emphasized harassment and delay rather than direct confrontation with Roman heavy infantry, reflecting sophisticated understanding of Roman military capabilities and limitations. British warriors employed hit-and-run tactics that exploited their superior mobility while avoiding the close quarter combat situations where Roman training and equipment provided decisive advantages. Their use of war chariots, unfamiliar to Roman forces accustomed to fighting GIC and Germanic opponents, created psychological as well as tactical challenges that disrupted standard Roman battlefield procedures. Roman military adaptations to British conditions demonstrated the flexibility and professionalism that characterized Caesar's veteran legions. The famous incident of the standard-bearer of the 10th Legion leaping into the surf while carrying the eagle exemplified the individual courage and unit cohesion that enabled Roman forces to overcome initial tactical disadvantages through superior discipline and training. The establishment of a secure beachhead required coordinated efforts by multiple units working under difficult conditions while maintaining formation integrity. Despite enemy harassment, the construction of a fortified camp according to standard Roman procedures provided a secure base for subsequent operations while demonstrating Roman engineering capabilities to British observers. The camp's defensive works, constructed within hours of landing, featured the characteristic ditch and rampart systems that had proven effective throughout Roman military campaigns. The speed and efficiency of Roman field fortification impressed British tribal leaders who recognized the implications of such organizational capabilities for sustained military operations. British diplomatic initiatives during Caesar's first expedition revealed sophisticated political strategies that attempted to exploit Roman unfamiliarity with local conditions while testing the invaders' intentions and capabilities. Tribal ambassadors approached Roman positions under flags of truce, offering submissions and hostages while gathering intelligence about Roman strength, equipment, and immediate objectives. These diplomatic contacts enabled British leaders to assess Roman military capabilities firsthand while demonstrating their own political sophistication to potential Roman allies or enemies. The role of Mandubricus, king of the Trinovantes, illustrated the complex political calculations that British tribal leaders faced when confronted with Roman military power. His decision to seek Roman protection against Catavalian expansion reflected pragmatic assessment of changing political realities rather than simple submission to foreign authority. His negotiations with Caesar provided both sides with opportunities to explore potential alliance relationships while establishing precedents for future diplomatic arrangements. Caesar's withdrawal after 18 days on British soil left profound impacts on both Roman and British strategic thinking that would influence subsequent developments across northwestern Europe. The expedition had demonstrated Roman capability to project military power across the English Channel while revealing the formidable challenges that any sustained campaign would face. British tribal leaders gained valuable intelligence about Roman military methods while recognizing the inevitability of future more substantial Roman interventions. The political ramifications of Caesar's first expedition extended throughout the British tribal system, creating new alliance patterns and strategic calculations that reflected the changed geopolitical situation. Tribes that had previously focused primarily on local rivalries now needed to consider their positions relative to potential Roman intervention, while those with existing Roman connections could leverage these relationships to enhance their domestic political positions. Caesar's second expedition in 54 BC represented a significantly more ambitious undertaking that reflected lessons learned from the previous year's experiences and demonstrated Roman determination to establish permanent influence in British affairs. The expanded force consisted of 5 legions plus auxiliary units, totaling approximately 25,000 men supported by cavalry forces and specialized equipment designed for sustained operations in British conditions. The inclusion of GIC cavalry units provided mobile forces capable of matching British tactical mobility while offering expertise in fighting Celtic opponents. The logistical preparations for the second expedition reveal the enormous organizational capabilities that enabled Roman military operations on unprecedented scales. Caesar's engineers constructed a fleet of over 800 vessels specifically designed for the British campaign, incorporating design modifications based on experience from the previous year's crossing. The vessels featured improved hull designs for beach operations, enhanced cargo capacity for transporting cavalry horses and siege equipment, and standardized construction that facilitated rapid assembly and maintenance. The expanded scope of the second expedition enabled more systematic exploration of British political structures and military capabilities. Roman forces penetrated inland beyond the Tempames, encountering diverse tribal territories and settlement types that provided comprehensive intelligence about British society and economy. The march through Kent and Essex revealed the agricultural wealth that supported British tribal systems while demonstrating the defensive capabilities of British hill forts and Opt. Civilorinus emerged as the primary coordinator of British resistance during Caesar's second expedition, demonstrating the leadership capabilities and strategic vision that enabled effective opposition to Roman military superiority. His selection as overall British commander reflected recognition by multiple tribal groups that coordinated resistance offered better prospects for success than individual tribal efforts. His background as a Cativalonian leader provided him with extensive military experience and political connections that facilitated the creation of intertribal coalitions. The strategic approach developed under Cavalloni's leadership emphasized mobility, local knowledge, and coordinated harassment rather than direct confrontation with Roman heavy infantry formations. British forces systematically destroyed crops and livestock in advance of Roman movements, creating supply difficulties that forced Roman foraging parties to operate under constant threat of ambush. The removal of civilian populations from Roman approach routes denied intelligence to Roman commanders while ensuring that local knowledge remained exclusively available to British forces. British tactical innovations during the second expedition demonstrated adaptive capabilities that incorporated lessons learned from observing Roman military methods. The construction of obstacles across forest paths and the creation of concealed defensive positions reflected understanding of Roman tactical preferences and movement patterns. British forces developed new techniques for attacking Roman supply columns and isolated detachments while avoiding the pitched battles that would favor Roman advantages and training and equipment. The siege of Cavalonis' stronghold north of the Tempaemes represented the climax of the second expedition and demonstrated both Roman siege capabilities and British defensive innovations. The British fortress, possibly located near modern Wheat Hampstead, featured sophisticated defensive works that combined natural advantages with artificial obstacles designed to counter Roman siege techniques. The defensive system included multiple lines of earthworks, concealed obstacles, and prepared positions that maximize the effectiveness of British defensive forces. Roman siege operations reveal the technical expertise and logistical capabilities that enabled systematic reduction of fortified positions despite determined resistance. Caesar's engineers employed standard Roman siege techniques, including the construction of circumvallation works, the deployment of artillery engines, and the coordination of multiple assault columns against different sections of the defensive perimeter. The siege demonstrated Roman ability to maintain complex operations over extended periods while managing supply lines and maintaining unit cohesion under difficult conditions. The diplomatic resolution of the siege reflected the pragmatic calculations that influenced both Roman and British strategic decisions. Livornus' decision to negotiate rather than fight to the death demonstrated sophisticated understanding of political realities and the long-term implications of continued resistance. His willingness to provide hostages and tribute while maintaining nominal independence established precedents for client-king relationships that would characterize subsequent Roman-British interactions. The submission of multiple British tribes during Caesar's second expedition created new political alignments that would influence British affairs for decades. The Trinonts, Tenimani, Sigontia, Ankelites, Bybrochi, and Cassi all sent embassies offering submission and hostages, demonstrating the widespread recognition of changed political circumstances. These submissions created obligations and expectations on both sides that would influence subsequent diplomatic and military developments. The immediate aftermath of Caesar's expeditions witnessed significant political transformations within British tribal systems that reflected both direct Roman influence and indirect effects of exposure to Roman military and political methods. Tribes that had submitted to Caesar gained advantages in local conflicts through their Roman connections, while those that had resisted faced potential isolation or Roman retaliation. The redistribution of political power created new alliance patterns and territorial arrangements that departed significantly from pre-invasion configurations. The enhanced status of pro-Roman tribal leaders created new forms of political authority that combined traditional Celtic kingship with innovations derived from Roman client-king models. The leaders could access Roman military support and commercial opportunities while maintaining domestic legitimacy through traditional cultural practices and religious observances. The balance between Roman expectations and indigenous political customs required sophisticated diplomatic skills that not all tribal leaders possessed. Economic changes following Caesar's expeditions reflected both immediate disruption and longer-term adaptations to new political realities. The tribute payments demanded by Caesar created financial burdens that required increased agricultural production and more efficient resource extraction. Simultaneously, expanded trade opportunities with Roman merchants provided new sources of wealth that could offset tribute obligations, while introducing new luxury goods and technologies that enhanced elite status. The acceleration of Romanization in southeastern Britain occurred through multiple channels that extended beyond direct political control to encompass cultural, economic, and technological influences. British tribal elites adopted Roman customs, architectural styles, and material culture as markers of sophistication and political alignment. The construction of new settlements. Incorporating Roman urban planning principles demonstrated the appeal of Roman organizational methods while providing venues for displaying wealth and status derived from Roman connections. The introduction of Roman coinage systems supplemented traditional British monetary arrangements while facilitating more sophisticated commercial transactions. Roman coins circulated alongside indigenous British issues, creating mixed monetary systems that reflected the complex political relationships between Roman authorities and British tribal leaders. The adoption of Roman weight standards and denominational systems enabled participation in broader Mediterranean commercial networks while maintaining local political symbols and cultural references. Architectural innovations reflected the influence of Roman construction techniques and urban planning concepts. On British settlement development, the appearance of rectangular buildings constructed according to Roman proportional systems marked significant departures from traditional British circular architecture. The use of Roman building materials, including tile, mortar, and dressed stone, required new technical knowledge and specialized craftsmen who either immigrated from Roman territories or learned techniques through direct contact with Roman construction projects. The transformation of British military organization incorporated lessons learned from direct confrontation with Roman forces while adapting Roman techniques to British tactical preferences and environmental conditions. British smiths began producing weapons that combined traditional Celtic designs with improvements derived from Roman military technology. The standardization of equipment within tribal military units reflected Roman organizational principles while maintaining distinctly British cultural characteristics. Religious and cultural changes following Caesar's expeditions revealed the complex processes through which Roman influence penetrated British society without completely displacing indigenous traditions. The continued importance of Druids and traditional Celtic religious practices demonstrated cultural resilience while the adoption of Roman religious concepts and practices reflected the appeal of Roman civilization. The construction of Romano-British temples that combined Roman architectural forms with Celtic religious functions exemplified the syncretic processes that characterized this transitional period. The century between Caesar's expeditions and Claudius's invasion witnessed gradual but fundamental transformations in British society that prepared the ground for permanent Roman occupation. Trade relationships expanded dramatically, creating economic dependencies that influence political decisions and cultural preferences. The flow of Roman goods into Britain accelerated, while British exports, including metals, agricultural products, and slaves, found ready markets throughout the Roman world. Diplomatic relationships between British tribes and Roman authorities evolved into complex systems of alliance, tribute, and mutual obligation that created precedents for imperial administration. British tribal leaders who maintained Roman connections could access military support and commercial opportunities, while serving Roman strategic interests through intelligence gathering and regional stabilization. These relationships created networks of collaboration that would facilitate the eventual Roman conquest while providing frameworks for provincial administration. The political evolution of British tribes during this period reflected both internal developments and external pressures that transformed traditional Celtic governance systems. The emergence of more centralized authority structures enabled more effective coordination of resources and military forces while facilitating diplomatic relationships with Roman authorities. The adoption of written administrative Systems supplemented oral traditions while creating permanent records that supported more sophisticated forms of governance and commercial activity. The gradual transformation of Romano-British relationships during the century following Caesar's expeditions created the political and economic foundations that would facilitate Claudius's systematic conquest of Britain in 43 AD. The complex networks of alliance, tribute, and commercial interdependence that had developed between British tribes and Roman authorities provided both the intelligence and justification necessary for permanent occupation, while internal British political developments had created vulnerabilities that Roman military planners could exploit with devastating effectiveness. The death of Cunobelinus around 40 AD precipitated a succession crisis within the Catalonian Confederation that fundamentally altered the balance of power in southeastern Britain. His sons, Caratus and Tagadamnus, inherited their father's extensive territories, but lacked his diplomatic skills and political authority, creating opportunities for both internal rivals and external intervention. Their aggressive policies toward neighboring tribes, particularly the Atrebates under Verica, violated the careful equilibrium that had maintained relative stability in post-Carian Britain. Verica's flight to Rome in 42 AD provided Claudius with the diplomatic pretext necessary to justify military intervention while offering detailed intelligence about British political divisions and military capabilities. As a long-standing Roman client, Verica possessed intimate knowledge of tribal relationships, defensive preparations, and potential collaboration opportunities that proved invaluable for invasion planning. His presence in Rome also provided symbolic legitimacy for Roman intervention as the restoration of a legitimate ruler rather than unprovoked aggression. The strategic planning for the Claudian invasion reflected lessons learned from Caesar's expeditions while incorporating military innovations and logistical capabilities developed during subsequent imperial campaigns. Aulus Plucius, selected as invasion commander, brought extensive experience from Pannonian and Dalmatian campaigns where he had demonstrated expertise in amphibious operations, tribal warfare, and the establishment of permanent provincial administration. His appointment indicated imperial commitment to systematic conquest rather than temporary occupation. The invasion force assembled for the British campaign represented one of the largest military concentrations deployed by Rome during the early imperial period. Four legions formed the Expeditions Corps: the 2nd Augusta under Vespasian, the 9th Hispana, the 14th Geminina, and the 20th Valeria Victrix, totaling approximately 20,000 veteran legionaries with extensive campaign experience. These legions were supplemented by equal numbers of auxiliary infantry and cavalry units drawn from throughout the empire, including Germanic cavalry, specialists, GIC infantry, and Thracian light troops whose diverse capabilities provided tactical flexibility for operations in unfamiliar terrain. The logistical preparations for the invasion demonstrated the sophisticated administrative capabilities that distinguished Imperial Roman military operations from earlier Republican campaigns. Supply bases established along the GA coast accumulated enormous quantities of equipment, provisions, and construction materials necessary for sustained operations. The assembly of transport vessels required coordination with naval authorities throughout the Western Mediterranean, while specialized equipment, including siege engines, bridge-building materials, and field fortification tools, reflected careful planning for diverse operational requirements. The selection of landing sites reflected detailed intelligence gathering that identified optimal locations for establishing secure beachheads while minimizing British defensive advantages. Richborough and Kent emerged as the primary landing point due to its natural harbor facilities, proximity to major British settlements, and favorable terrain for rapid inland movement. The site's geographic advantages included protection from prevailing winds, adequate water supplies, and elevated positions suitable for defensive installations that could secure the invasion force during its vulnerable initial phases. The British response to the invasion revealed both the strengths and limitations of their military organization under the unprecedented stress of coordinated Roman assault. Craticus and Todumnus successfully mobilized substantial forces from their own territories and allied tribes, creating armies that may have exceeded Roman numbers while possessing intimate knowledge of local terrain and conditions. However, the forces lacked the standardized equipment, systematic training, and unified command structure that characterized Roman military organization. The initial British strategy emphasized defensive positions along river lines that could channel Roman advances into prepared killing zones while exploiting natural obstacles to negate Roman advantages in heavy infantry combat. The Medway crossing presented the first major test of this defensive approach as British forces established strong positions on the river's eastern bank that commanded all practical crossing points. Their defensive works incorporated both natural features and artificial obstacles designed to maximize casualties among attacking Roman forces while providing secure withdrawal routes if positions became untenable. The four-day Battle of the Medway demonstrated both British tactical capabilities and the superior operational coordination that gave Roman forces decisive advantages in sustained combat. British forces initially succeeded in repelling Roman crossing attempts, inflicting significant casualties while maintaining formation integrity despite intense pressure from Roman artillery and missile weapons. Their use of chariots and coordinated charges disrupted Roman formations while providing mobile platforms for elite warriors who could strike at vulnerable points in Roman lines. Roman tactical adaptations during the Medway engagement revealed the flexibility and professional competence that enabled successful operations against unfamiliar enemies employing unknown tactical methods. The deployment of Germanic auxiliary cavalry and night crossing operations exploited British unfamiliarity with Roman auxiliary capabilities while demonstrating the value of diverse unit types within Roman military organization. The systematic coordination of multiple crossing attempts forced British defenders to divide their attention while preventing concentrated resistance. At any single point, the death of Togedamnus during the Medway fighting eliminated one of the primary British commanders while demonstrating the personal risks that Celtic leadership traditions imposed on tribal aristocrats. His loss disrupted British command coordination at a crucial moment. While providing Caraticus with sole authority over remaining resistance forces, the psychological impact of his death on British morale was partially offset by the martyrdom effect that inspired more determined resistance among his followers and allied tribal warriors. The Roman advance toward Camilla Dunham following the Medway victory demonstrated the systematic approach that characterized Placius's campaign strategy. Rather than pursuing defeated British forces immediately, Roman commanders consolidated their positions while establishing secure supply lines and communication networks that could support sustained operations. The construction of temporary camps at regular intervals created a chain of fortified positions that protected Roman supply columns while providing bases for further advances. British resistance during the advance to Camilla Dunham evolved from conventional battlefield tactics towards guerrilla warfare methods that exploited Roman unfamiliarity with British terrain and settlement patterns. Quirites reorganized surviving forces into smaller, more mobile units that could strike at Roman supply lines and isolated detachments, while avoiding direct confrontation with main Roman forces. This tactical evolution reflected sophisticated understanding of Roman military capabilities and the futility of conventional resistance against superior Roman organization. The siege and capture of Camillium marked the symbolic culmination of the initial invasion phase while providing Roman forces with a strategic base for subsequent operations throughout southeastern Britain. The Optim's elaborate defensive works, which had protected the Cativalonian capital for decades, proved inadequate against systematic Roman siege techniques and overwhelming numerical superiority. The speed of the city's fall demonstrated Roman siege capabilities while providing access to the wealth and administrative infrastructure necessary for establishing permanent occupation. Claudius's personal arrival for the final assault on Camulodunum served multiple political functions that extended far beyond immediate military requirements. His presence provided symbolic legitimacy for the conquest while demonstrating imperial commitment to British operations. The inclusion of war elephants in his ceremonial entry created spectacular propaganda effects that impressed both Roman audiences and British observers. While his brief 16-day stay established personal authority over the conquest without exposing him to extended campaign risks, the establishment of Roman administration in conquered territories began immediately following military occupation, demonstrating the systematic approach that distinguished imperial conquest from earlier Roman expansion methods. Military commanders worked closely with civilian administrators to create governance structures that could maintain order, while extracting resources necessary for continued operations. The appointment of client kings in cooperative tribal territories provided continuity with existing political structures while ensuring Roman oversight of local affairs. The integration of cooperative British tribal elites into Roman administrative systems offered significant advantages to both occupiers and collaborators, while creating new forms of political authority that combined Roman and Celtic traditions. British aristocrats who accepted Roman authority could maintain their social positions and economic privileges while gaining access to Roman commercial networks and military protection. Local knowledge and established relationships with tribal populations made them invaluable intermediaries for Roman administrators unfamiliar with British customs and languages. Dubnas of the Regni emerged as the most successful example of Romano-British elite collaboration, establishing a client kingdom that survived for decades while providing a model for similar arrangements throughout the province. His palace at Fishbourne demonstrated the material benefits available to cooperative British rulers, featuring Roman architectural styles, luxury goods, and artistic programs that rivaled contemporary Italian villas. His political success depended on balancing Roman expectations with indigenous political traditions, requiring diplomatic skills that few British leaders possessed. The administrative challenges of governing conquered British territories required innovations in Roman provincial management that adapted imperial systems to local conditions and requirements. The diversity of British tribal structures from centralized kingdoms to loose confederations necessitated flexible approaches that could accommodate different political traditions while maintaining overall Roman authority. The establishment of civics based on existing tribal boundaries provided continuity with pre-conquest political arrangements while facilitating Roman administrative control. The economic integration of British territories into Roman commercial networks created new opportunities for wealth generation while imposing tribute obligations that required increased agricultural production and resource extraction. Roman merchants established trading posts throughout conquered territories, exchanging manufactured goods for British raw materials, including metals, agricultural products, and slaves. The introduction of Roman monetary systems facilitated commercial transactions while providing mechanisms for tribute collection and tax assessment. Regional variations in British responses to Roman conquest reflected the diverse political, economic, and cultural conditions that characterized different tribal territories. Southeastern tribes that had maintained extensive pre-conquest contacts with Rome generally adapted more readily to Roman administration, while peripheral regions with limited Roman exposure often resisted more vigorously. The proximity to continental European markets influenced economic adaptation, while geographic factors affected military vulnerability and administrative accessibility. The asymptote under pursuit exemplified the complex calculations that British tribal leaders faced when determining their responses to Roman conquest. His decision to accept client-king status provided short-term security for his people while maintaining nominal independence and traditional cultural practices. However, his kingdom's wealth and strategic location made it vulnerable to Roman exploitation, while his lack of male heirs created succession problems that would eventually trigger major rebellion. The Byzantine Confederation under Cartimandua faced different challenges. Due to their extensive territories and complex internal political structures, her alliance with Rome provided military support against internal rivals while offering protection from hostile neighboring tribes. However, her pro-Roman policies created domestic opposition that eventually led to civil conflict, demonstrating the difficulties of maintaining both Roman approval and indigenous political legitimacy. Craticus' flight to Wales following the fall of Camalodunum marked the beginning of a new phase of British resistance that would test Roman military capabilities in unfamiliar terrain against opponents employing sophisticated guerrilla tactics. His arrival among the Silures Nordovas provided these Welsh tribes with experienced leadership and detailed knowledge of Roman military methods. While his royal status attracted support from tribes throughout unconquered Britain, his presence transformed local Welsh resistance into a coordinated campaign that posed serious strategic challenges for Roman occupation forces. The mountainous terrain of Wales provided natural advantages for guerrilla warfare that negated many Roman military advantages while favoring defenders familiar with local conditions. The narrow valleys, dense forests, and steep hillsides restricted Roman cavalry operations while providing concealment for British forces. The scattered settlement patterns made it difficult for Roman forces to locate and engage British armies, while the harsh climate and limited agricultural resources created logistical challenges for sustained Roman operations. Craticus' strategic approach in Wales emphasized mobility, local knowledge, and popular support rather than direct confrontation with Roman heavy infantry. His forces conducted systematic raids against Roman supply lines and isolated garrisons while avoiding pitched battles that would favor Roman tactical advantages. The recruitment of local warriors familiar with mountain warfare provided him with forces ideally suited for guerrilla operations. While his reputation as a successful resistance leader attracted volunteers from throughout unconquered Britain, the Roman response to Welsh resistance required tactical adaptations and specialized equipment designed for mountain warfare operations. Roman commanders developed new techniques for siege operations against Hill forts positioned on steep terrain while their engineers created specialized equipment for bridge construction and road building in difficult topographic conditions. The deployment of auxiliary units with mountain warfare experience provided tactical capabilities that standard legionary formations lacked. The construction of Roman forts throughout Wales demonstrated the systematic approach that characterized imperial pacification strategies. These installations provided secure bases for offensive operations while controlling strategic routes and communication networks. The spacing and positioning of forts created overlapping zones of control that limited British movement while providing mutual support during enemy attacks. The standardized construction methods enabled rapid deployment of defensive capabilities while ensuring consistency in supply and communication systems. Hillford warfare represented one of the most challenging aspects of British resistance as these fortified positions combined natural defensive advantages with sophisticated engineering that had evolved over centuries of intertribal conflict. British hill forts featured multiple lines of defense, including massive earthwork ramparts, complex entrance arrangements, and internal obstacles designed to channel attackers into prepared killing zones. The elevated positions provided excellent observation capabilities while complicating Roman siege operations. Roman siege techniques required modifications to address the unique challenges posed by British hill fort architecture and positioning. Standard Roman circumvallation methods proved difficult to implement on steep terrain, while the water supplies and food storage capabilities of well-prepared hill forts enabled extended resistance. Roman engineers developed specialized equipment, including portable siege towers and modified artillery pieces, designed for uphill assault operations. The siege of Carrhae's final stronghold in 51 AD demonstrated both the effectiveness of British defensive innovations and the ultimate superiority of Roman siege capabilities when systematically applied. The British position, possibly located in the Severn Valley, featured elaborate defensive works that maximized natural advantages while incorporating lessons learned from previous encounters with Roman forces. The defensive system included multiple rampart lines, concealed obstacles, and prepared positions that forced Roman attackers to advance under constant harassment. Roman tactical coordination during the final siege revealed the professional competence and systematic training that enabled successful operations against sophisticated defensive positions. The deployment of multiple assault columns against different sections of the British perimeter prevented concentrated resistance while exploiting tactical opportunities created by British defensive arrangements. The systematic reduction of outer defensive lines demonstrated Roman persistence and engineering capabilities while gradually eliminating British defensive advantages. Carrhae's capture following the defeat of his forces marked the end of organized British resistance in Wales while providing Roman authorities with a prestigious prisoner whose fate would demonstrate imperial clemency and political sophistication. His betrayal by Cartmandua revealed the complex political calculations that influenced British tribal decisions during the conquest period. The subsequent treatment in Rome, where Claudius granted him freedom and honors, served propaganda purposes while demonstrating Roman confidence in their ultimate victory. The aftermath of Carrhae's defeat witnessed continued resistance throughout Wales and northern Britain as local leaders maintained guerrilla operations. Despite the loss of their most prominent commander, the Siluras continued systematic attacks against Roman positions, demonstrating remarkable persistence despite repeated defeats and enormous casualties. Their resistance required sustained Roman military commitment that diverted resources from other provincial development projects while testing imperial resolve. The establishment of permanent Roman military presence throughout conquered British territories required enormous resources and administrative innovations that transformed both Roman military organization and British society. The construction of legionary fortresses at sites including Colon, Chester, and York created permanent bases for major military units while providing centers for regional administration and economic development. These installations required constant supply from throughout the empire while providing markets for local British products and services. The development of Roman road networks throughout Britain facilitated military communications and supply operations while creating infrastructure that would support long-term economic development. The construction of major routes including Watling Street, Man Street, and FSY Way required enormous labor, inputs, and engineering expertise while demonstrating Roman commitment to permanent occupation. These roads connected military installations with administrative centers while providing access to natural resources and agricultural areas essential for provincial self-sufficiency. The systematic Roman occupation of Britain during the 50s AD created the administrative and military framework that would ultimately provoke the most serious challenge to imperial authority in the province's early history. The death of Protaagus around 60 AD precipitated a succession crisis within the Aeni kingdom that Roman administrators handled with characteristic insensitivity to local customs and legal traditions, transforming a manageable political transition into a catastrophic rebellion that would threaten the entire Roman presence in Britain. Protaagus had ruled the Aesai as a Roman client king for nearly 2 decades, maintaining the delicate balance between imperial expectations and indigenous political traditions that characterize successful Romano-British collaboration. His kingdom encompassed the fertile agricultural lands of Norfolk and northern Suffolk, territories that had supported substantial populations through intensive cereal cultivation and cattle raising since the Iron Age. The Aeni had adapted more readily to Roman commercial practices than many British tribes, adopting Roman coinage systems while maintaining their traditional social structures and religious observances. The legal arrangements governing Protaagus' succession reflected his attempts to secure his kingdom's future while satisfying Roman administrative requirements. His will designated the Emperor Nero as co-heir alongside his daughters, a diplomatic gesture intended to ensure imperial protection for his family while maintaining Aeni territorial integrity. This arrangement followed precedents established in other client kingdoms throughout the empire where rulers sought to balance dynastic continuity with imperial approval through carefully crafted inheritance provisions. Roman administrative response to Protaagus' death revealed the systematic exploitation that characterized imperial policy toward client kingdoms during periods of political transition. Catus Decianus, the provincial procurator, responsible for financial administration, immediately implemented aggressive policies designed to extract maximum revenue from territories while eliminating the autonomous status that had protected the kingdom during Protaagus' lifetime. His actions reflected broader imperial policies that viewed client king deaths as opportunities for direct annexation and increased taxation. The treatment of Boudica and her daughters represented the most egregious violation of both Roman legal principles and Celtic social customs, creating personal grievances that would fuel the rebellion's intensity and duration. Roman officials ordered the flogging of Boudica, a punishment typically reserved for slaves and criminals, while her daughters suffered sexual assault that violated fundamental Celtic concepts of aristocratic honor and family sanctity. These actions demonstrated contempt for indigenous political traditions while creating martyrs whose suffering would inspire widespread resistance. The confiscation of Iceni property extended beyond royal estates to encompass private holdings throughout the kingdom, affecting not only aristocratic families but also common farmers and craftsmen who had prospered under Pressaraga's rule. Roman officials seized livestock, agricultural equipment, and stored grain reserves that represented the accumulated wealth of generations while demanding immediate payment of tribute obligations that had previously been managed through the royal administration. These policies created economic hardship throughout territories while eliminating the traditional leadership structures that had maintained social stability. The recall of loans that had been extended to British tribal leaders during the conquest period created additional financial pressures that affected tribes throughout southeastern Britain. Seneca, the philosopher and imperial advisor, had invested enormous sums in British ventures, expecting substantial returns from the province's developing economy. His demand for immediate repayment of these loans, totaling 40 million sestertii according to Dioasius, created financial crises for tribal leaders who had borrowed against future agricultural production and tribute obligations. British tribal responses to these Roman policies revealed the extent of anti-Roman sentiment that had developed beneath the surface of apparent cooperation during the conquest period. The Trinonts, who had been among the first tribes to submit to Roman authority, joined the Aeni rebellion, despite their long-standing Roman connections, indicating that Roman administrative abuses had alienated even previously cooperative populations. Their participation demonstrated that the rebellion represented more than simple resistance to particular grievances, but rather a coordinated uprising against Roman occupation itself. The religious dimensions of the rebellion reflected the central role of Celtic spiritual traditions in organizing resistance to Roman cultural and political domination. Druids who had survived Roman persecution campaigns emerged from hiding to provide ideological leadership for the uprising, framing resistance in terms of cosmic struggle between Celtic gods and Roman oppression. Their prophecies and ritual preparations created psychological momentum for the rebellion while providing spiritual sanctions for violence against Roman settlers and collaborators. The timing of the rebellion reflected careful coordination that exploited Roman military vulnerabilities created by ongoing campaigns in Wales. Suetonius Paulinus had concentrated substantial Roman forces on Anglesey for his assault on the Druidical stronghold, leaving southeastern Britain defended by reduced garrisons and auxiliary units of questionable loyalty. British intelligence networks had monitored Roman troop movements, identifying the optimal moment for launching coordinated attacks against Roman installations throughout the region. The initial phase of the rebellion witnessed simultaneous uprisings across a vast area of southeastern Britain, demonstrating organizational capabilities that Roman administrators had seriously underestimated. Aeni and Trinantian forces coordinated their attacks to maximize psychological impact while preventing Roman commanders from concentrating their scattered forces for effective counterattacks. The speed and coordination of these initial assaults revealed sophisticated planning that had been conducted in secret despite Roman intelligence networks and administrative oversight. Camulodunum emerged as the rebellion's first major target due to its symbolic importance as the center of Roman administration and the site of Claudius's temple, which had become a focal point for British resentment of Roman cultural imperialism. The colonia established at Camulodunum housed Roman veterans who had received land grants carved from confiscated British territories, creating ongoing grievances among displaced indigenous populations. The veterans' arrogant Behavior toward British civilians had generated widespread hostility that made the settlement particularly vulnerable to coordinated attack. The Temple of Claudius at Camillum represented everything that British rebels found objectionable about Roman occupation, combining religious innovation with political symbolism and economic exploitation. The temple's construction had required enormous financial contributions from British tribes, creating tribute burdens that impoverished local populations, while glorifying their conqueror. The building's massive scale and elaborate decoration demonstrated Roman architectural capabilities while serving as permanent reminders of British subjugation and cultural subordination. British assault tactics against Camulodunum reflected both traditional Celtic warfare methods and innovations developed through observation of Roman military techniques. The attackers employed coordinated infantry assault, supported by archery and sling fire while using their superior numbers to overwhelm Roman defensive positions. Through sustained pressure, their intimate knowledge of the settlement's layout enabled them to exploit weaknesses in Roman defensive arrangements while avoiding areas where Roman advantages in equipment and training provided decisive benefits. The massacre of Camulodunum's population demonstrated the rebellion's intensity and the depth of British hatred for Roman occupation. Men, women, and children were killed without discrimination, while Roman buildings were systematically destroyed and their contents scattered or burned. The Temple of Claudius was demolished with particular thoroughness. Its destruction, serving both practical and symbolic functions by eliminating a major defensive position while repudiating Roman religious and political authority. Archaeological evidence from Camulodunum reveals the systematic nature of the destruction, with burned layers containing Roman pottery, coins, and personal possessions that were abandoned during the hasty evacuation attempts. The discovery of human remains in wells and storage pits suggests that some Romans sought hiding places that became death traps when discovered by British attackers. The complete absence of valuable objects in destruction layers indicates that British forces systematically looted Roman properties before burning the structures. The psychological impact of Camulodunum's fall reverberated throughout Roman Britain, demonstrating British military capabilities while exposing the vulnerability of Roman settlements to coordinated attack. News of the massacre spread rapidly through Roman communication networks, creating panic among Roman civilians and administrative personnel throughout southeastern Britain. The speed and completeness of the settlement's destruction challenged Roman assumptions about their military superiority and the permanence of their occupation. Roman military responses to the initial rebel victories revealed both the strengths and limitations of imperial military organization when confronted with unexpected threats. Bilius Carialis, commanding the 9th Legion from its base at Longthor, attempted to relieve Camuin with forces that proved inadequate for confronting the massive British armies that had assembled. His defeat and the destruction of his legion's infantry components eliminated a substantial portion of Roman military strength while providing British forces with captured weapons and equipment. The tactical circumstances of the 9th Legion's defeat demonstrated British improvements in military organization and battlefield coordination since the conquest period. British forces employed coordinated attacks that prevented Roman formations from maintaining their characteristic discipline and cohesion, while their superior numbers enabled them to envelop Roman positions and eliminate escape routes. The capture or destruction of Roman artillery and siege equipment deprived Roman commanders of technological advantages that had previously compensated for numerical inferiority. Londinium emerged as the rebellion's next major target due to its importance. as a commercial center and its vulnerability to coordinated attack. The settlement had developed rapidly during the conquest period, attracting Roman merchants, craftsmen, and administrative personnel who had established businesses serving both Roman and British markets. Its position on the Thames provided excellent transportation connections while offering access to continental European trade networks that made it economically valuable to both Romans and rebels. The evacuation of Londinium presented Roman authorities with agonizing choices between military necessity and civilian protection, ultimately demonstrating the harsh realities of imperial strategic calculations. Suetonius Paulinus, who had returned from Wales upon learning of the rebellion, assessed the settlement's defensive capabilities and concluded that his protection would require resources that could be better employed elsewhere. His decision to abandon Londinium to its fate reflected military pragmatism while creating enormous psychological pressure on remaining Roman forces. British assault tactics against Londinium revealed increasing sophistication in siege warfare and urban combat techniques developed. Through their experiences at Camalunum, the attackers coordinated simultaneous assaults from multiple directions while employing fire as a primary weapon against Roman buildings constructed with flammable materials. Their systematic approach to destruction indicated planning that went beyond simple revenge to encompass strategic objectives related to eliminating Roman economic infrastructure. The destruction of Londinium surpassed even the Camilla Dunham massacre in its thoroughness and brutality as British forces vented their accumulated grievances against Roman merchants and settlers who had profited from imperial exploitation. The systematic burning of warehouses, shops, and residential areas eliminated the commercial infrastructure that had made Londinium economically important, while demonstrating British determination to eradicate Roman presence completely. Archaeological evidence suggests that the destruction created burned layers up to half a meter thick in some areas. Verili's fate as the third major target demonstrated the rebellion's comprehensive scope and the British determination to eliminate all major Roman settlements in southeastern Britain. The municipium had been granted to the Cativlani as recognition of their cooperation with Roman administration, making its destruction particularly significant as a repudiation of collaborative relationships with imperial authorities. The settlement's mixed population of Romans and Romanized Britons made it a symbol of the cultural transformation that rebels sought to reverse. The tactical evolution evident in British attacks on successive targets revealed learning processes that improved their military effectiveness, while maintaining the psychological momentum necessary for sustained resistance. British commanders had observed Roman defensive responses and adapted their assault techniques accordingly, developing methods for overcoming Roman tactical advantages while exploiting weaknesses revealed through previous encounters. Their ability to maintain unit cohesion and strategic coordination despite enormous casualties demonstrated remarkable military leadership and popular commitment. Roman casualty figures from the rebellion's initial phase, estimated at 70,000 by Tacitus, reflected both the scale of British military success and the vulnerability of Roman civilian populations to coordinated indigenous resistance. These losses included not only Roman citizens but also British collaborators, who had adopted Roman customs or served Roman administrative functions. The indiscriminate nature of British violence eliminated potential intermediaries who might have facilitated negotiated settlements while demonstrating the rebellion's comprehensive rejection of Roman authority. The military situation facing Suetonius Paulinus upon his return from Wales required immediate strategic decisions that would determine the rebellion's ultimate outcome. His available forces consisted of the 14th Legion, portions of the 20th Legion, and various auxiliary units that totaled approximately 10,000 men facing British armies that may have numbered over 100,000 warriors drawn from multiple tribal territories. The numerical disparity necessitated tactical approaches that could exploit Roman advantages and training equipment and discipline while avoiding situations that favored British numerical superiority. The selection of battlefield positions became crucial for Roman tactical success as Suetonius needed terrain that would channel British attacks into narrow frontages where Roman heavy infantry could maintain formation integrity despite overwhelming numbers. His choice of a position backed by forest with narrow approach routes demonstrated sophisticated understanding of tactical geography while providing secure withdrawal routes if Roman lines collapsed under British pressure. The positioning of auxiliary archers and cavalry on the flanks created overlapping fields of fire that would maximize casualties among attacking British forces. British tactical approaches to the decisive battle reflected confidence derived from their previous victories, combined with traditional Celtic warfare methods that emphasized individual courage and mass assault tactics. Boudicca's forces, deployed in traditional fashion with warriors arranged by tribal affiliation while their families positioned themselves in wagons behind the battle line to observe the expected victory. This arrangement demonstrated British confidence while creating potential obstacles to retreat if the battle developed unfavorably. The battle itself revealed both the strengths and limitations of Celtic military traditions when confronted with disciplined Roman resistance in favorable tactical circumstances. British initial assaults achieved limited success against Roman positions, but the inability to maintain coordinated pressure allowed Roman counterattacks that exploited gaps in British formations. The presence of non-combatants behind British lines created confusion and panic when Roman forces advanced, transforming tactical defeat into comprehensive disaster. Roman tactical coordination during the decisive engagement demonstrated the professional competence and systematic training that distinguished imperial forces from tribal armies regardless of numerical relationships. The 14th Legion's disciplined advance, supported by auxiliary missile fire and cavalry attacks against British flanks, created cascading failures in British resistance that led to complete collapse. Despite their enormous numerical advantages, the systematic pursuit that followed eliminated British military capabilities while demonstrating Roman determination to end the rebellion permanently. The aftermath of the decisive battle witnessed systematic Roman reprisals that eliminated remaining centers of resistance while demonstrating imperial determination to prevent future rebellions. Suetonius implemented policies designed to terrorize British populations into submission, including mass executions, property confiscations, and the destruction of agricultural resources that supported rebellious communities. These measures created widespread famine and displacement that eliminated British military capabilities while demonstrating the consequences of resistance to Roman authority. Administrative reforms implemented following the rebellion suppression reflected lessons learned about the causes of British resistance and the administrative practices that had contributed to the uprising. The replacement of Catastianes with more moderate financial administrators indicated recognition that excessive exploitation had created the grievances that fueled rebellion. The appointment of governors with instructions to balance military security with economic development demonstrated imperial understanding that sustainable occupation required British cooperation, rather than simple military domination. The long-term consequences of Boudicca's Rebellion transformed Romano-British relationships while establishing precedents for imperial administration that would influence provincial development for centuries. The demonstration of British military capabilities forced Roman recognition of indigenous political traditions and social customs that required accommodation rather than elimination. The rebellion's failure eliminated organized resistance to Roman occupation while creating conditions for gradual cultural integration that would characterize subsequent Romano-British development. The establishment of permanent Roman military presence throughout formerly rebellious territories required enormous resource commitments that influenced imperial strategic planning throughout northwestern Europe. The construction of additional fortifications, the deployment of increased garrison forces, and the development of improved intelligence networks created military infrastructure that would support Roman occupation while providing security for economic development. These investments demonstrated imperial commitment to permanent British occupation while creating economic opportunities for both Roman and British populations. The systematic Roman reprisals that followed Boudicca's defeat created the military and political foundation necessary for completing the conquest of Britain's remaining unconquered territories. The rebellion suppression had demonstrated both British military capabilities and the ultimate superiority of Roman organization when properly applied. While the enormous casualties inflicted on rebellious populations eliminated potential sources of future resistance, Roman commanders recognized that permanent security required the elimination of all independent British strongholds, particularly the Welsh tribal territories that had provided refuge for resistance leaders, and the Northern Brigantian Confederation, whose vast territories remained largely outside direct Roman control. Suetonius Paulinus' return to Wales in 61 AD represented the resumption of systematic conquest operations that had been interrupted by the two rebellion. His previous assault on Anglesey had achieved tactical success through the destruction of ducal installations and the massacre of religious personnel, but the strategic objectives of eliminating Welsh resistance capabilities remained incomplete. The island's religious significance extended throughout Celtic Britain, making its complete subjugation essential for preventing future rebellions inspired by Druidical prophecies and ritual preparations. The final assault on Anglesey required sophisticated amphibious operations that demonstrated Roman engineering capabilities while overcoming natural defensive advantages that had protected the island for centuries. Roman engineers constructed specialized transport vessels designed for the shallow waters surrounding Angles, incorporating design modifications that enabled rapid deployment of infantry forces while providing platforms for artillery support during landing operations. The vessels featured reinforced hulls capable of withstanding impact with rocky shores, while their shallow drafts permitted approach to beaches that would be inaccessible to standard Roman warships. British defensive preparations on Anglesey reflected desperate attempts to preserve the last major Druidical center in Britain through coordinated resistance that combined religious fervor with tactical innovation. The island's defenders included not only local or Orevician warriors, but also Druids and religious devotees from throughout unconquered Britain who viewed the struggle as a cosmic battle between Celtic gods and Roman oppression. Their defensive positions incorporated both natural features and carefully built obstacles, designed to break Roman landings and inspire courage among the Britons. The crossing to Anglesey was no simple task. Roman soldiers found themselves not only against physical defenses but also against the weight of spiritual resistance. On the shore stood Druids, robed and chanting, raising curses and calling upon their gods. Fires were lit, voices rose in ritual, and the air was heavy with fear. For soldiers unfamiliar with such scenes, it was a moment of deep unease. Yet discipline held. Centurions kept order, auxiliaries familiar with Celtic ways steadied the lines, and the Romans advanced. They stormed the island, tearing through the defenses, burning sacred groves, and cutting down the Druids. What had been the heart of Celtic spiritual life, its schools, rituals, and wisdom passed through generations, was silenced. Archaeology later revealed the traces: burned layers, shattered shrines, desperate offerings buried hastily in hope of divine protection. With Anglesey destroyed, the network that bound the tribes spiritually and politically was broken. Still, resistance continued in the Welsh mountains. Tribes such as the Silures and Ordovices fortified their hilltops, creating strongholds with layered defenses and hidden paths. They knew the land, and they used it well, striking suddenly, vanishing, and always forcing Rome to adapt. But the legions, supported by auxiliaries skilled in mountain warfare, built roads and siege engines even for rugged hillsides. Slowly, through sieges and starvation, Rome broke these strongholds. One by one, the tribes fell, until Isca Fortress rose as the permanent seat of Roman power in Wales, a fortress so vast that it signaled not just conquest but permanence. The north brought a different challenge. The Brigantes, the largest confederation of tribes, ruled vast lands from the Pennines to the Dales. At first, Rome's way in was not through war but through politics. Queen Cartimandua allied herself with Rome, ruling as client and protector. But when she divorced her husband Venutius, civil war tore the kingdom. Venutius, standing for independence, became the rallying voice against Rome. Twice Cartimandua called Rome to her aid, and twice the legions marched north to secure her power. Through these struggles, forts and supply lines were built, laying the framework for a permanent Roman grip. Yet Venutius was not easily subdued. He led raids, ambushed supply lines, and used the terrain to his advantage. Roman legions, supported by Germanic cavalry and Gallic auxiliaries, had to adapt to this endless harassment. Slowly, they built fortresses at York and Chester, permanent symbols of Roman control. But the north was not pacified by politics alone. It required the steady grind of campaigns, each fort a nail hammered into the landscape. Then came Agricola, appointed governor in 77 AD. Skilled, patient, and experienced, he brought together all that had been learned in decades of conquest. He marched further than any before him, determined to push Rome's line into the far north. He pacified the last Welsh rebels, secured northern England, and pressed into Scotland, into the land of the Caledonians. Here, Rome faced its fiercest trial. The Caledonians were unlike the tribes Rome had met before. They were united, disciplined in their own way, and led by Calgacus, a leader remembered for his stirring words, that Rome makes a desert and calls it peace. They fought not merely for survival but for the freedom of their homeland. In 83 or 84 AD, the two forces met at Mons Graupius. The Caledonians took the high ground, their war cries rolling across the hills. The Romans advanced with their usual discipline, shields tight, formations locked, auxiliaries flanking. The clash was brutal. Wave after wave of Caledonian charges crashed against the Roman lines. Courage they had in plenty, but Roman tactics and armors slowly ground them down. By nightfall, thousands of Britons lay dead. Agricola claimed victory. Yet it was a hollow triumph. Though Mons Graupius ended in Roman favor, Scotland was never truly conquered. The land was too vast, too rugged, and its people too determined. Rome built its walls, Hadrian's, and later the Antonine, but these were lines of defense, not signs of domination. Beyond them, the Britons endured, proud and untamed. Still, Rome transformed Britain. Towns rose, roads stretched across the island, and villas appeared in the countryside with heated floors and bright mosaics. Trade flourished, wine from Gaul, oil from Spain, glass from the Mediterranean, all flowing into Britain, while grain, metals, and wool flowed out. The island became both a frontier and a province of the empire. But beneath the Roman surface, the old ways remained. Celtic tongues still filled the air, sacred sites still whispered their stories, and the memory of Boudica, the warrior queen who had once burned Roman towns and nearly driven the empire into the sea, remained a symbol of defiance. In time, Rome itself began to falter. By the early 400s, legions were recalled, towns abandoned, roads fell silent. Britain was left to govern itself. Into this vacuum came new peoples, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They carved out kingdoms in the east and south, while the native Britons were pressed westward into Wales, Cornwall, and across the Channel to Brittany. Their language evolved into Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, still spoken today, carrying the echo of ancient Britain. It was in this age of upheaval that legends grew. Among them, the stories of Arthur, a leader who stood against the Saxons, perhaps real, perhaps myth, but always remembered as a beacon of hope. Monks and saints spread Christianity, building monasteries that became centers of learning and prayer, preserving memory even as the world shifted. And though new storms came, Vikings, Normans, and countless others, the Brittonic spirit endured. Their songs, their language, their identity survived the centuries. Even now, in the rivers, hills, and old words of Britain, their voice can still be heard. The Briton story is not one of defeat, but of endurance. Through conquest and migration, through change and loss, they remained. Their resilience whispers still, soft but unbroken, across the land they once called home.